Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been going hunting every season for the past 12 years. I know the woods of southern Arkansas like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did until last week. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened out there, and I can't stop thinking about it. I need to get this off my chest because it's eating away at me, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. It was Thursday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. I'd taken a day off work to get an early start on the weekend hunting trip. The weather was perfect, not too cold, clear skies, just a light breeze rustling through the trees. I'd been out since dawn with no luck, just tracking and waiting. You know how it goes. I decided to try a different spot before calling it a day. There's this trail I know that cuts through a dense section of forest about 3 miles from the main road. It's a bit off the beaten path, which is why I like it. Fewer hunters means less spooked game. I parked my truck at the small clearing that serves as an unofficial lot and headed in with just my rifle, some water, and a few energy bars. The sun was getting lower, casting those long shadows through the trees that make everything look a little different. I'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes, moving slow and quiet like you do when you're hunting. The forest was alive with normal sounds, birds, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I first noticed something ahead on the trail. At first, I thought it might be another hunter, but something felt off about the silhouette. It was too tall, way too tall. My first rational thought was that it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I focused, I could tell this wasn't a bear. This thing was easily 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and covered in what looked like dark brown hair or fur. I froze mid-step, squinting to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The figure was moving deliberately, not like an animal, wandering aimlessly. It was stepping off the path toward a large oak tree about 50 yards ahead of me. I'm an experienced hunter. I've seen all kinds of wildlife in these woods. Deer, bears, coyotes, you name it. But this was something else entirely. My curiosity got the better of me. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to get a better look without making noise. Big mistake. The creature suddenly stopped and turned in my direction. Even from that distance, I could tell the exact moment it spotted me. Its whole body language changed, went from relaxed to tense in an instant. And then it just stared at me. I can't explain what happened next in any way that makes sense. Our eyes locked, and I felt this overwhelming sense of recognition. Not like I knew this thing, but like there was an intelligence behind those eyes that understood exactly what I was. It wasn't looking at me the way an animal looks at you. It was assessing me. The creature's face contorted, and it bared its teeth. They weren't fangs like a predator. They were wide and flat, more like molars, but massive. Then it made this sound, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move. It's not that I decided to stay still. My body literally wouldn't respond to any commands my brain was giving it. Pure primal fear had taken over. I've faced down angry bears before, had close calls with injured bucks, but nothing has ever frozen me like the sight of this thing. After what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, my survival instinct kicked in. I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the creature, trying not to make any sudden movements. That's when it let out this sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. A piercing, screeching howl that started low and built to a pitch that hurt my ears. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard come out of an animal's mouth. It was almost human, but distorted and amplified to an impossible degree. The sound stopped me dead in my tracks. When I focused on the creature again, My blood ran cold. It had moved closer, much closer. It was now maybe 20 feet away from me, and I hadn't even seen it move. How something that big could cover that much ground that quickly and that silently is beyond me. Now that it was closer, I could see it clearly. It was massive, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The hair covering its body wasn't uniform, thicker in some places, especially around the shoulders and chest, thinner on the face and hands. Its hands, they were like ours, but bigger, with thick fingers and what looked like dark nails or claws. Its chest was heaving, like it was breathing heavily, and I could hear each breath, in, out, rhythmic and deep. Its face was, God, I don't even know how to describe it. Not quite human, not quite ape, something in between. The eyes were deep set and brown, with an intensity that felt like they were burning right through me. I realized I was still holding my rifle, and in that moment, it felt both reassuring and completely useless. Some instinct told me that firing would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I slowly, very slowly, bent down and placed the rifle on the ground, then straightened back up with my hands slightly raised to show I wasn't a threat. The creature watched every movement. Then it took another step toward me. Its gait was odd, heavy and deliberate, with arms swinging low. Each footfall made a soft thud against the forest floor. It was close enough now that I could smell it, a strong, musky odor like wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. Those eyes never left mine, not once. It kept coming, step by step, until it was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body. I was sure this was it. This was how I was going to die, alone in the woods, killed by something that wasn't supposed to exist. And then, inexplicably, it stopped. For several seconds that felt like hours. We just stood there, less than 10 feet apart. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I was terrified that any movement would trigger an attack. Then, without warning, it turned away from me, just turned and started walking in the other direction. It moved a few yards at a normal pace, then suddenly accelerated to a speed that shouldn't be possible for something that size. It crashed through the underbrush and between trees, making more noise now, as if it no longer cared about being detected. I watched, completely stunned, as it disappeared into the forest. Even after it was gone from sight, I could hear it moving away, the sounds growing fainter, until there was nothing but the normal forest sounds again. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the ground. I was trembling all over, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air. I don't know how long I sat there trying to process what had just happened. 5 minutes? 15? Time seemed irrelevant. Eventually, I managed to get back on my feet. I picked up my rifle with shaking hands and started backing away, never turning my back to the direction the creature had gone. Every few steps, I'd stop and listen, terrified I'd hear that howl again or the sound of it returning. It took me twice as long to get back to my truck as it had to walk in. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed or watched. When I finally reached the clearing and saw my truck, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I managed to get them in the ignition. I drove out of there faster than was safe on those dirt roads, not slowing down until I hit pavement. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? What would I say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot in the woods today, and we had a staring contest. I'd sound insane, but the encounter has been eating away at me. I can't sleep. When I do, I dream about those eyes, that intelligence, the recognition I saw in them. What keeps bothering me most is that it could have killed me. I was completely at its mercy. It was bigger, stronger, faster than me. I was alone, and even though I had a rifle, I never even had a chance to use it. It could have ended me right there, but it chose not to. It walked away. Why? I've been researching non-stop since it happened, looking up sightings, reports of similar encounters. Some details match, others don't. I've never been one for conspiracy theories or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm just a regular guy who likes to hunt. But I know what I saw. It was real, it was intelligent, and it let me live. I haven't been back to the woods since that day. I'm not sure if I ever will. How do you go back to normal after something like that? How do you walk into the forest knowing that everything you thought you knew about the world is wrong? I keep wondering if I should report it somewhere. But who would believe me? And more importantly, do I want to bring attention to whatever this thing is? It left me alone. Maybe the best thing I can do is return the favor. All I know is that the woods I thought I knew are different now. There's something out there that shouldn't exist, but does. And it saw me, it recognized me. And for some reason, it decided to let me go. Story 2. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. Even after all these years, my hands still shake when I think about it. I need to write this down, though, because I'm getting older, and I want people to know what happened that day in 1926 near the South Fork of the Little Colorado River. My name is Lillian, and I had only been married to Jake for about 8 months when we moved to that remote spot east of Springerville. Jake had 2 boys, Billy and Fred, both 4 years old. Their mother had died during a fever the year before, and I'd taken on raising them like they were my own. They were sweet boys, full of energy and always exploring. Our cabin wasn't even finished yet. Jake was still working on the roof, and one wall still had gaps between the logs that let the cold spring air whistle through at night. We'd covered it with an old tarp, but it wasn't ideal. Still, we were making it work. Jake hunted and trapped to provide for us, and I kept house and watched the boys. We had our dog Lady, a big shepherd mix who was fiercely loyal and followed those boys everywhere. That morning in early April started like any other. Jake had left before dawn to track a bear the locals called Clubfoot that had been killing livestock in the area. He expected to be gone most of the day. After breakfast, I sent the boys outside to play in the meadow in front of our cabin while I cleaned up. It was a beautiful spring day, warm enough that they didn't need heavy coats, just their light jackets. Around midday, I was sweeping the front porch when I heard them shouting. At first, I thought they were just playing one of their games, but something in their voices made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. They were running toward the cabin as fast as their little legs could carry them, pure terror on their faces. "Mama Lil! Mama Lil!" Billy was screaming. Big hairy man watching us." Fred was just behind him, crying so hard he could barely speak. "No clothes! He's got no clothes!" My first thought was that some vagrant might be in the area, maybe someone dangerous. I dropped my broom and rushed down the steps, meeting them halfway across the yard. I knelt down and grabbed both boys by the shoulders. Where did you see this man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm while my heart hammered in my chest. Both boys pointed toward the tree line at the edge of the meadow, maybe 100 yards away. "There, by the big rock," Fred sobbed. I looked up, squinting against the sunlight. At first, I didn't see anything. Then something moved behind a tree. It was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, and dark, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. For a second, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but no, its proportions were all wrong. Then it stepped out from behind the tree, and I felt like someone had dumped ice water down my spine. It was standing fully upright on 2 legs, like a man, but it wasn't a man. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, completely covered in dark hair except for its face, which looked almost like a cross between a man and an ape. And the boys were right. It wasn't wearing any clothes. I couldn't move for a second. I just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then the thing took a step forward, and another, and suddenly it was moving across the meadow toward us with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. It wasn't running exactly, more like loping, but covering ground incredibly fast. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was maternal instinct, or maybe just pure fear, but I shoved the boys behind me and picked up my broom from where I'd dropped it. I started running toward the creature, screaming as loud as I could. I think I surprised it, because it hesitated for just a second. That was all I needed. I swung that broom with every ounce of strength I had, catching it right across what I guess was its chest. I don't know if it was the surprise or the force of my swing, but the thing actually stumbled backward and fell to the ground. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned, grabbed both boys by the hands, and ran back to the cabin as fast as we could go. We burst through the door, and I slammed it shut behind us, dropping the wooden bar across it. The boys were crying hysterically now. I pushed them toward the corner farthest from the door and windows. "Get under the bed," I told them. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe." They crawled under our big bed, huddling together. I grabbed Jake's shotgun from above the fireplace and checked to make sure it was loaded. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. That's when I heard it, a scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not human, not animal. It was high-pitched and guttural at the same time, filled with rage and frustration. Lady, who had been barking frantically since we ran inside, was now growling low in her throat, the fur on her neck standing straight up. I went to the window and peeked out. The creature was on its feet again, standing at the edge of the yard. It was even bigger than I'd first thought. Its arms hung long at its sides, the hands, because they were hands, not paws, clenched into fists. It screamed again, showing teeth that looked yellowed and sharp. Then it started moving again, but slower this time, circling the cabin. I ran from window to window, trying to keep track of where it was. The smell hit me before I actually saw it again, a horrible, overpowering stench like rotting meat and something musky and animal. I gagged and covered my mouth with my sleeve. It was moving along the side of the cabin now, and to my horror, I realized it was heading for the wall that wasn't completely finished. I heard it breathing, heavy, rasping breaths as it reached the tarp-covered section. Through a crack between the logs, I saw its eye, a cold brown eye, far too intelligent for an animal, staring right at me. I backed away, pointing the shotgun at the wall, wondering if the shot would even penetrate whatever that thing was. The boys were whimpering under the bed. I wanted to comfort them, but I didn't dare take my eyes off that wall. The creature moved away from the tarp, continuing around the cabin. I followed its progress by the sound of its breathing and the awful smell that seemed to seep through the walls. It reached the front of the cabin again, and I heard it on the porch, the wooden boards creaking under its weight. Then came the sound of scratching at the door, followed by a heavy thud that made the whole cabin shake. It was trying to break in. Lady went absolutely wild, barking and throwing herself against the door. I yelled at her to stop, afraid she'd hurt herself, but she was beyond hearing me. Then somehow she managed to squeeze through a gap near the floor that I hadn't even noticed was there. I heard her snarling and the creature's scream of surprise or pain. I ran to the window just in time to see Lady latched onto the thing's leg, her teeth sunk deep into its hairy flesh. The creature was swinging its arm, trying to dislodge her. It caught her with a backhanded blow that sent her flying off the porch. But as soon as she hit the ground, she was up again, charging back. This happened 3 more times. Lady attacking, the creature throwing her off, Lady coming back for more. Each time she was thrown, she hit the ground harder, but she kept getting up. On the 4th attempt, she somehow managed to leap high enough to lock her jaws around the creature's neck. The thing let out a terrible howl and started backing away from the cabin, clawing at Lady, trying to pull her off. But Lady wouldn't let go. I could see blood now, dark against the creature's hair. It stumbled across the yard toward the tree line, still fighting with Lady. About halfway across the meadow, the creature finally managed to tear Lady away from its neck. It threw her to the ground with such force that I heard the impact from inside the cabin. Lady didn't get up this time. The creature stood there for a moment, swaying, one hand pressed to its neck. Then it turned and loped back into the trees, leaving a trail of dark droplets on the grass. I waited, shotgun ready, watching to make sure it was really gone. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I told the boys to stay put and cautiously opened the door. The smell of the creature still hung in the air, but I couldn't see any sign of it. Lady was lying in the middle of the meadow, not moving. I ran to her, shotgun still in my hands. When I reached her, I knew immediately she was gone. Her body was broken, bones at odd angles, one actually protruding from her side. She'd given her life defending us. I knelt beside her, tears streaming down my face, stroking her fur one last time. That's when I heard movement in the tree line. I jerked my head up, raising the shotgun, my finger tightening on the trigger. A figure stepped out from the trees, and I almost fired before I realized it was Jake. He was running toward me, his own rifle in his hands, a look of confusion and alarm on his face. I've never been so glad to see anyone in my life. I don't know what that thing was. Jake tracked the blood trail into the woods, but lost it after about a mile. We buried Lady that evening, and Jake nailed the cabin wall shut that night. We moved back to town 2 weeks later. I couldn't stand being there anymore, jumping at every sound from the forest. To this day, I dream about those cold brown eyes staring at me through the crack in the wall. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still smell that awful stench. Story 3. I've never told anyone outside our group about what happened to us that night in 1988. Even now, typing this makes my hands shake a bit. I guess enough time has passed that I can finally talk about it, though I'm not sure anyone will believe me. I don't blame you if you don't. I'm not sure I would either, if I hadn't lived through it. It was spring of '88, late April. I was a junior in college and an Air Force ROTC cadet. My name is Marcus Tanner, and I was leading a team of 4 other cadets in what was supposed to be a routine escape and evasion exercise, the kind of thing that looks great on paper but usually just amounts to a bunch of college kids stumbling around in the woods playing soldier. The training area was this densely wooded wilderness about 40 minutes from campus. It was pretty remote, lots of ridges, valleys, a few creeks running through it. Perfect for these kinds of exercises. We'd been there plenty of times before for land navigation and field training. Nothing unusual had ever happened. Our mission was simple: simulate being a downed aircrew behind enemy lines. We had to navigate to an extraction point by morning while avoiding the enemy team that would be hunting us. Basic stuff. We started at dusk, around 7:30 or so. The light was already fading fast when we set out. My team consisted of Johnson, my point man, Reeves and Wilson, my flankers, and Davis bringing up the rear. We were all dressed in BDUs with our faces blacked out with camo paint. Standard gear: compasses, maps, canteens, MREs and flashlights we weren't supposed to use unless absolutely necessary. No weapons except for rubber training knives. They wanted us to focus on evasion, not confrontation. We followed a trail that ran alongside a small creek. To our right was a steep ridge that rose maybe 60 or 70 feet above the trail. The plan was to follow the creek westward for about 2 miles, then cut north across an open field to our first checkpoint. Everything started normally enough. The sun set quickly, and soon we were moving by moonlight. It wasn't completely dark. The moon was nearly full, and once our eyes adjusted, we could see well enough to follow the trail without too much trouble. The first sign that something was off came about 45 minutes in. Davis radioed me from the rear. 6. This is 4. I think something's following us. We were using simple radio codes. I was 6 as the team leader, and the others were numbered, in order. I stopped the team and whispered back, 4, this is 6, confirm. I keep hearing movement in the trees behind us. Thought it was nothing at first, but it's been consistent for the past 10 minutes. I figured it was probably the opposing team setting up to ambush us, That was part of the exercise. They were supposed to try to capture us if they could. But something about Davis's tone made me uneasy. He wasn't a jumpy guy. Former high school linebacker, built like a truck, not the type to get spooked easily. Roger that, continue but stay alert. We pushed on. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard the first rock fall. It wasn't big, just a small stone tumbling down the ridge to our right. Then another, and another, like someone or something was moving along the ridge parallel to us, dislodging small rocks as they went. Johnson noticed it too. 6, you hearing that? I nodded. The rocks weren't falling randomly. They were following our movement. When we stopped, the falling stopped. When we moved, it started again. Davis radioed again, more urgency in his voice this time. 6, the movement behind us is getting closer. At this point, I was convinced it was the opposing team trying to spook us. I decided to turn the tables. I gathered everyone close and whispered, "Let's check out that ridge. Form a skirmish line and move up. If they're setting up an ambush, we'll catch them first." We spread out about 10 feet apart and climbed the ridge. It was steep and covered with loose rocks and fallen leaves that made footing tricky. The whole time, I kept expecting to run into the other team, but we reached the top without encountering anyone. The top of the ridge was flat for about 20 yards before dropping off on the other side. We searched the entire area, calling out to each other in whispers as we moved. Nothing, not a single sign that anyone had been there. "Maybe it was just animals," Reeves suggested. "Deer or something." It made sense, except for one thing, the timing. The way the rocks fell in sync with our movements was too perfect to be coincidental. We headed back down to the trail and continued westward. Johnson took point again. I was behind him, Reeves and Wilson in the middle, and Davis bringing up the rear. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile when it started again, rocks falling, movement on the ridge. And now Davis was radioing more frequently. 6, there's definitely something following us. I can hear it moving through the brush. I sent Wilson back to support Davis. Safety in numbers, right? We kept moving, but everyone was on edge now. The woods felt different, hostile somehow. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 9. We still had hours to go before reaching the extraction point. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The rocks kept falling, but now they were getting bigger. Not just pebbles, but fist-sized stones tumbling down the slope. And the movement on the ridge was louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Whatever was up there wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. Johnson and I were trying to spot a landmark ahead when it happened. Wilson and Davis came sprinting past us, faces white beneath their camo paint. "Run!" Davis shouted, abandoning all pretense of radio discipline. "Something's coming!" Before I could even ask what he meant, I heard it. A crashing sound from behind us, like something large was plowing through the underbrush. Heavy, rhythmic thuds that I felt in my chest more than heard. Branch snapping sounds, but not like when you or I would push through brush. These were cracks, like baseball bats being broken. We ran, all 5 of us sprinting northward away from the creek, away from the ridge, toward the open field we were supposed to cross later. Johnson was in front, then me, with the others close behind. The crashing sounds followed, staying just behind us, but never quite catching up. When we reached the edge of the field, the sounds stopped. Just stopped, like whatever it was wouldn't leave the tree line. We collapsed in the middle of that field, gasping for breath, too terrified to speak. After a few minutes, when nothing emerged from the woods, I finally got my voice back. "What the hell was that? What did you see?" Davis shook his head. "I didn't see it. I heard it. It was moving fast, breaking through stuff like it wasn't even there. Too big to be a person." Wilson nodded. "It was charging right at us. I swear to God, Marcus, whatever it wasn't human." We stayed in that field for nearly an hour, huddled together, watching the tree line. Nothing came out. Eventually we had to move on. We still had a mission to complete, and my pride wouldn't let me call for an early extraction unless someone was hurt. We gave the woods a wide berth, staying in open areas as much as possible for the rest of the night. We reached the extraction point just before dawn. The opposing team was already there, looking bored and complaining about the cold. Their leader, Thompson, greeted me with a smirk. "You guys look like hell. Did we scare you that bad?" I pulled him aside. "Was that you guys following us on the ridge by the creek?" He looked confused. "What are you talking about? We've been set up here since 8 waiting for you to show up. We never left this area. You didn't send anyone to follow us? To ambush us?" "No, man. That wasn't the plan. We were supposed to stay here and intercept you when you approached the extraction point." I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't tell our ROTC instructors either. What was I supposed to say? That we got chased by something in the woods? That rocks fell from a ridge in perfect timing with our movements? That we heard something crashing through the forest that made 5 grown men run for their lives? They'd think we were making excuses for failing the exercise. The next morning, after getting a few hours of sleep, Johnson and I went back. I'm still not sure. Why? Curiosity, I guess. Or maybe we needed to prove to ourselves that we hadn't imagined the whole thing. We went back to the area where we'd heard the crashing sounds. The ground was hard, too hard to show footprints. But the brush, that was another story. There were broken branches everywhere, snapped clean through. Not cut, not bent, broken. And not just at ground level or human height. Some of the breaks were 8, 9 feet off the ground. How do you explain that? We didn't stay long. Something about that place still felt wrong, even in broad daylight. Years later, around 1995, I was flipping through a magazine when I came across an article about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Just for kicks, I started researching if there had been any sightings in our area. What I found chilled me to the bone. There had been multiple reports of a large bipedal creature in those same woods dating back to the 70s. Local hunters had stories about rocks being thrown at their camps. Hikers reported feeling watched, and several people described hearing heavy footsteps following them, always staying just out of sight. I've never gone back to those woods. I don't do much hiking anymore either. Sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear those sounds. Rocks tumbling down a hillside, branches snapping like gunshots, and those heavy, pounding footsteps coming closer and closer. Whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't human, and it wasn't just curious. It was hunting us. I'm just grateful it decided not to catch us. Story 4. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last February. My wife Claire and I have been living near Twisp in the Methau Valley for about 8 years now. We're outdoor people, hiking, fishing, snowshoeing in winter, you name it. Nothing about the wilderness really spooked us before that day. It was February 11th, 2011. I remember the date because it was exactly a week before Claire's birthday, and I'd been planning a surprise weekend trip to Portland. The day was brutally cold, must have been around 15 degrees, but the sky was that perfect Washington blue that makes everything look like a postcard. No clouds, no wind, just that biting cold that makes your nose hairs freeze when you breathe in. We decided to take our 2 chocolate labs, Ripley and Duke, for their afternoon walk. Instead of our usual trail near the house, I suggested we drive out to Peregrine Lake, about 15 miles from our place. The lake would be completely frozen over, and I thought it would make for a nice change of scenery. Claire agreed, so we loaded the dogs into my Ford F-150 and headed out. When we arrived around 2 in the afternoon, the parking area was completely empty. Not surprising given how cold it was. We put the dogs on their leashes and started walking along one of the trails that eventually climbs up to a ridge overlooking the lake. The snow crunched under our boots, that hollow sound you get when it's been really cold for a long time. The dogs were loving it, sniffing around and pulling at their leashes. I remember thinking how everything seemed so still. No birds chirping, no wind in the trees. just that heavy silence you get in deep winter. We reached the ridge about 20 minutes into our walk and stopped to take in the view. The lake stretched out before us, a flat white expanse surrounded by pine trees dusted with snow. Claire was pointing out where we'd gone kayaking last summer when she suddenly grabbed my arm. "Rob, look, there's someone out on the ice." I followed where she was pointing and saw movement about halfway across the lake. At first, I thought it was just another hiker or maybe an ice fisherman heading toward the small island in the middle of the lake, but something felt off right away. "Why would anyone be out there without gear?" Claire whispered. She was right. Whoever it was didn't have a sled or fishing equipment, no backpack I could see either. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure was moving with purpose, taking long strides across the ice. As I focused, I realized why Claire's grip on my arm was getting tighter. This wasn't right. The proportions were all wrong. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was tall. Really tall. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. And it was dark, not like it was wearing dark clothes, but like its entire body was a deep, almost black color. Except for its head, which was this strange copper brown, with what looked like thick hair hanging down past its shoulders. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, more to myself than to Claire. The dogs had noticed it too. They were both standing at alert, their bodies tense. Duke, our older lab, started making this low, growling sound I'd never heard from him before. I pulled my binoculars from my jacket pocket and focused on the figure. It was moving quickly despite not running, just taking these massive, deliberate strides across the ice. Each step looked heavy, purposeful. It wasn't dressed like a person, no jacket, no winter gear I could make out, just this uniform dark mass from the shoulders down. As I watched, a pair of Canada geese flew overhead, and the thing stopped abruptly. It turned its entire upper body to follow them, not just its head, but shoulders and torso moving in this smooth, deliberate way. The movement was so intentional, so focused. Then it simply resumed walking toward a dense cluster of trees on the far side of the lake, near the island. When it got about 150 yards from where we stood, it reached some tall reeds and cattails near the shoreline. Most of its body disappeared in the vegetation, but I could still see its shoulders and head above the brush. That's when I realized just how tall it really was. Claire tugged at my sleeve. "Rob, let's go." Her voice was shaking. "I don't like this." I lowered the binoculars and looked at her. She was pale, her eyes wide. She's not someone who scares easily. We've encountered bears on trails before, and she's always kept her cool. But this was different. She was genuinely frightened. "It's probably just some guy," I said, not believing it myself. "Maybe a hunter or—" "That's not a person," she cut me off, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know it's not. Let's go back to the truck, now." She turned and started back down the trail, pulling Ripley with her. Duke, however, wouldn't budge. He stood rigid, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared into the trees. I called his name, then again more firmly, but he just whined, his eyes never leaving that spot across the lake. This scared me more than anything else. Duke is impeccably trained. He never disobeys commands. But here he was, refusing to move, every muscle in his body tense. "Duke, come!" I said again, more sharply this time. He finally turned to look at me, and the expression in his eyes made my stomach drop. There was fear there, pure animal fear. I clipped his leash on and practically had to drag him away from the ridge. He kept looking back, his body language all wrong. As we started down the trail, I couldn't help but look back myself. The thing was nowhere to be seen now. I caught up with Claire, who was walking briskly toward the parking area. "Did you see how it moved?" she asked without looking at me. "How it watched those birds? That wasn't human movement, Rob." "I know," I admitted. The reality of what we'd seen was sinking in. I'm going to go back and see if I can find any tracks. Claire stopped and turned to me, her expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Are you out of your mind? No way. We're leaving. Just give me 10 minutes, I said. I'll be quick. You can wait in the truck with the dogs. She argued, of course, but eventually gave in. I handed her Duke's leash and my truck keys, watched her hurry down to the parking area, then turned and headed back up to the ridge. My heart was pounding as I reached the overlook again. The lake looked peaceful, innocent, no sign of whatever we'd seen. I scanned the trees where it had disappeared, but saw nothing moving. I decided to make my way down to the shoreline to look for tracks. The snow on the trail was hard-packed from hikers, but once I veered off toward the lake, I was sinking in up to my shins. It took me about 5 minutes to reach the area with the cattails where I'd last seen the figure. The vegetation was thicker than it had looked from above, easily 7 feet tall in places. The ground was a mix of frozen mud and ice near the lake's edge. I pushed through the reeds, looking for any sign of disturbance or tracks. The snow and ice were crusted over from multiple freeze-thaw cycles, making it difficult to identify clear footprints. But as I moved through the cattails, I noticed areas where the vegetation had been pushed aside, creating a rough path toward the trees. It could have been from deer or other animals, but the path seemed too wide, too intentional. As I followed this path, the silence around me became oppressive. No birds, no wind, not even the distant sound of traffic. Just my own breathing and the occasional crack of ice beneath my boots. I became acutely aware of how alone I was. When I reached the tree line, I stopped. The path continued into the dense pines, disappearing into shadows. Something told me not to follow. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around. That's when I heard it. A crack from somewhere in the trees, like a heavy branch breaking under weight. Then another. I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. Silence again. But I could feel something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming sense of being observed, evaluated. I've been in the woods my whole life, hunted since I was a kid, and I know what it feels like when a predator has its eyes on you. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to the trees. When I reached the cattails again, I heard another crack, closer this time. That was enough for me. I turned and half walked, half ran back through the reeds toward the trail. By the time I reached the truck, I was out of breath and sweating despite the cold. Claire was sitting inside with the engine running, both dogs in the back seat. Duke was still on edge, whining occasionally and looking out the windows. "Did you find anything?" Claire asked as I climbed in. "Nothing definitive," I said, not wanting to tell her about the path or the sounds I'd heard. She was scared enough already. The ground's too frozen for clear tracks. We drove home mostly in silence. That night, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a very tall person wearing dark clothing. Maybe the copper-colored head was a hood or hat of some kind. Maybe the strange movement was due to someone navigating carefully across ice. But we both knew none of those explanations fit. Whatever we saw that day wasn't human. The height, the coloring, the deliberate movements, especially the way it watched those geese, turning its entire upper body with that smooth, focused motion, none of it was normal. It's been over a decade now, and we've never gone back to that lake. Claire still gets visibly uncomfortable whenever I bring it up, so mostly I don't. But I think about it often, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I find myself scanning the trees, listening for heavy footsteps or breaking branches. Duke passed away 3 years ago, but until his final days, he would sometimes stand at our living room window, staring out at the forest behind our house, with that same tense posture from that day. It always made my skin crawl. I've researched local legends, read about cryptid sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing quite matches what we saw. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot or any other named creature. I honestly don't know what it was. but I know what I saw, what Claire saw, and how our dogs reacted. Something was crossing that frozen lake that February afternoon. Something tall, dark, and moving with purpose. Something that didn't belong in our understanding of the natural world. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep at night, I wonder if it saw us too. If it remembers us the way we remember it. And if someday our paths might cross again. Story 5. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family and close friends because, well, people think you're crazy when you start talking about things like this. But I need to get this off my chest after all these years, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened back in August of '72 when I was 10 years old. My family lived in Calgary, but we were visiting some family friends in Medicine Hat for the weekend. I was a pretty normal kid, loved being outdoors, catching frogs, climbing trees, you know, the usual stuff kids did before video games took over. My parents were big on camping, so I'd grown up seeing deer, moose, and even the occasional black bear from safe distances. I thought I knew what all the animals in Alberta looked like. I was wrong. So wrong. It was August 26th, a hot Saturday. Our families decided to spend the day at Strathcona Park along the South Saskatchewan River. It was perfect. The sun was blazing, the water was cool, and us kids had been swimming and splashing around all morning. Around 1 or so, the adults started calling us back for lunch. They'd set up a picnic area about 150 yards from the river, up a winding dirt path, through some trees and bushes. I remember being absolutely starving after all that swimming. You know how hungry you get as a kid after being in water for hours. So when they said lunch was ready, I took off running ahead of everyone else. My friend Mark's mum yelled something about waiting up, but I was already halfway up the path, practically tasting the sandwiches and chips I knew were waiting. That's when it happened. I was maybe 75 yards from the river, jogging up this path that curved through some scrubby trees and berry bushes. I suddenly stopped dead in my tracks. The smell hit me first, this awful, putrid stench that made my stomach turn. It's hard to describe exactly, but imagine a dog that got soaked in the rain, then rolled around in week-old garbage and maybe a dead animal or two. That sickly sweet rot mixed with wet fur and something else. Something I can't even put into words. It was so strong my eyes actually watered. I stood there frozen, trying to figure out where that horrible smell was coming from, when I heard a rustling sound from the right side of the path. I turned my head, and that's when I saw it. About 15 feet away, partially hidden by some Saskatoon berry bushes, was something. Its back was to me, thank God. I could only see it from behind, but what I saw doesn't match any animal I've ever heard of, even now. The thing was massive, at least 4 feet wide at the shoulders, and even though it was hunched over, it still stood about 5 feet tall. Its fur was this weird, patchy mix of black and reddish-brown, not like the solid color of a bear. The fur looked matted in places, almost like it was dirty or wet. But the strangest part was its head. From behind, it looked cone-shaped, and it seemed to sit directly on its shoulders. I couldn't see a neck at all. It was just this big, triangular head on these massive shoulders. I stood there completely still, barely breathing. I remember thinking in that moment that if I didn't move, it wouldn't notice me. But it knew I was there, it had to. Because suddenly, without turning around, it made this sound, this soft, chattering noise that wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a growl or a grunt, but almost like teeth clicking together rapidly, with this weird, almost human quality to it. Something deep in my brain, some primal instinct, just screamed, danger. I didn't think, I didn't even make a conscious decision to run. My body just turned and bolted back toward the river where my family was. As I ran, I heard it moving. These heavy footsteps behind me going thump, thump, thump on the ground. I heard bushes being crushed and branches snapping, but it wasn't following me directly. The sounds veered off toward the creek that ran perpendicular to the path. I sprinted faster than I'd ever run in my life, screaming for my dad the whole way. I nearly crashed into my parents and their friends who were just starting up the path with all the other kids. My mom grabbed me by the shoulders, asking what was wrong, why I was so pale. Between gasps for air, I tried to explain what I'd seen. "There's something up there," I remember pointing frantically back up the path. "It's huge. It's not a bear. It has red and black fur and a weird head." My dad immediately went into protection mode. He told everyone to stay put and grabbed a large stick from the ground. He and Mr. Wilson, our friend's dad, cautiously headed up the path to investigate. I begged them not to go, but they insisted they needed to check if there was a dangerous animal nearby. They were gone maybe 15 minutes. When they came back, they were relaxed, almost laughing. "Just a black bear, Calvin," my dad said, ruffling my hair. "Probably after those Saskatoon berries. He's gone now, headed toward the creek." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, tears welling up in my eyes from frustration. "Bears don't look like that. It didn't have a neck, and the sound it made—" That's when Mark, my friend, piped up. "Maybe it was a Sasquatch," he said with a grin. Everyone laughed. Even my mom, who had been comforting me, chuckled. I remember feeling so betrayed by that. I had no idea what a Sasquatch was at that point. I'd never heard the term before, but everyone's dismissal made me feel small and stupid. We ended up going back to the picnic spot as a group. My dad and Mr. Wilson led the way, making a big show of checking the bushes and joking about scaring off the monsters. I couldn't eat a thing, despite how hungry I'd been before. My stomach was in knots, and that putrid smell seemed to be stuck in my nostrils. The adults chalked my behavior up to an overactive imagination, or maybe heat stroke from being in the sun too long. The other kids kept making scary monster faces at me when the adults weren't looking. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting alone at the edge of the picnic area, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick, feeling miserable and confused. That's when Mr. Wilson's father, an old man we called Grandpa Joe, sat down next to me. He was in his 70s then, a lifelong Albertan who'd worked as a forest ranger decades earlier. "Your dad says you saw something in the bushes," he said quietly, not looking at me, but out toward the trees. I nodded, not expecting anyone to believe me at this point. "Want to tell me exactly what you saw? Not what they're saying you saw. What you actually saw with your own eyes." So I told him everything. The smell, the size, the weird cone-shaped head with no neck, the chattering sound. I described how the fur looked patchy and matted, how it moved. As I spoke, Grandpa Joe's face got more serious. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "You ever heard stories about the Sasquatch?" I shook my head. "Some folks call them Bigfoot down in the States," he continued. "They're supposed to be wild creatures that live in the forests all across North America, bigger than a man, covered in hair. Most people think they're just stories." "Like Mark said?" "But everyone laughed," I said. "People laugh at what they don't understand," Grandpa Joe replied, "or what scares them." He went on to tell me that when he was a ranger, he'd heard stories from indigenous guides about tall, hairy creatures that lived deep in the forests and mountains. He'd never seen one himself, he admitted, but he'd found strange footprints once that he couldn't explain, and heard weird calls in the night that didn't match any known animal. "I'm not saying that's what you saw," he said carefully. "Could have been a bear with mange or some kind of deformity, but I will say this, these woods and mountains hold more mysteries than most folks are comfortable admitting." That conversation with Grandpa Joe was the first time I felt like someone wasn't dismissing me outright. It didn't completely erase the fear I felt, but it helped me process what had happened. We left the park earlier than planned that day. I refused to go back up that path, so we had to take the long way around to get to the cars. Everyone was annoyed with me, but I didn't care. Nothing could have made me walk past those berry bushes again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive back, that cone-shaped head, and heard that chattering sound. I kept smelling that putrid odor, so much that I got up twice to check if something had died near the house. The next morning, my parents found me asleep on the living room floor with all the lights on. We went back to Calgary the next day. I spent the following weeks at the library, looking up everything I could find about Sasquatch and Bigfoot. There wasn't much. Some newspaper clippings, a few blurry photos, and accounts from people who'd seen something similar. But the descriptions matched. The height, the cone-shaped head that seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, the red-black fur. The smell was mentioned often too. My parents worried about my new obsession. They even took me to talk to our family doctor, who suggested I'd probably seen a bear, and my imagination had filled in the rest. The more I insisted it wasn't a bear, the more concerned they became. Eventually, I stopped talking about it, but I never stopped thinking about it. I'm 48 now. I've spent decades researching these creatures, connecting with others who've had similar experiences. I've gone back to Medicine Hat and Strathcona Park many times as an adult, hoping to find some evidence or explanation for what I saw that day. I never have. That smell, though, I've never encountered it again, but I would recognize it instantly. Sometimes I catch a faint whiff of something similar when I'm hiking in remote areas, and my heart starts racing immediately. I still don't know what I saw that day in 1972. Was it a Sasquatch, some unknown species, a deformed bear like some have suggested? I can't say for certain, but I know what I experienced was real. That smell, that chattering sound, that cone-shaped head with no neck. These details have stayed crystal clear in my mind for almost 40 years. Whatever it was, it changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that our world contains things we don't fully understand yet. And sometimes, when I'm camping and hear strange sounds in the night, I wonder if it's out there still, moving through the Canadian wilderness, occasionally crossing paths with people like me who are forever changed by the encounter. Story 6. I've debated sharing this for almost 50 years now. I'm 75 years old, and I figure if I don't get this off my chest now, I'll take it to my grave. What happened to me in 1973 changed me forever, and I've never been able to explain it properly to anyone, not even my wife. I used to be an avid hunter, grew up in a small town outside of Fresno, California, and my dad taught me to hunt from the time I could hold a rifle steady. By 1973, I was 30 years old, divorced from my first wife, and working as a mechanic at a local garage. Hunting was my escape from everything, the failed marriage, the long hours at work, all of it. That October, I took a week off to go deer hunting in the high Sierras. I had a sweet spot I'd found a few years back, remote enough that you wouldn't run into other hunters, but accessible by my old Ford pickup if you knew the logging roads. I brought along my dog, Rex, a black lab mix who was the perfect hunting companion, calm, quiet, and smart as hell. He'd been with me on dozens of hunts and never once spooked the game. The first 2 days were uneventful. I saw a few does, but was holding out for a buck. The weather was perfect, crisp fall air, clear skies. On the third day, I decided to try a new area about 20 miles deeper into the mountains. I followed an old logging road until it petered out into what was barely more than a game trail, then parked in a small clearing surrounded by pines. The elevation was probably around 8,000 feet, and the air had that thin, clean quality you only get in the high country. I remember checking my watch. It was just afternoon, and deciding to eat lunch before heading out. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, made a sandwich from the cooler, and tossed Rex some jerky. He was lying in the shade, totally relaxed. That's why what happened next scared me so badly. Mid-bite, Rex suddenly jumped up. His ears went back, and he started pacing around the truck. At first, I thought he might have caught the scent of a deer, but this was different. He wasn't excited. He was agitated, nervous. I'd never seen him act like this before. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, putting down my sandwich. Rex started barking. Not his normal bark, but this frantic, high-pitched sound I'd never heard him make. He ran to the edge of the clearing, then back to the truck, then to the edge again, like he couldn't decide whether to run or stay. Then he jumped into the bed of my pickup, something he only did when I told him to. I stood up, scanning the tree line, thinking maybe there was a bear nearby. We occasionally ran into black bears, but they usually wanted nothing to do with humans. I reached into the cab and grabbed my rifle, a Remington 7mm Magnum with a decent scope. I'd spent good money on that gun, and it had never let me down. Rex jumped back out of the truck and started barking toward the eastern edge of the clearing. I followed his gaze but didn't see anything at first. Then, about 50 yards away, I spotted something standing on a large boulder. My first thought was bear. It was the right size, and I could make out dark fur. But something felt wrong immediately. The way it was standing was too upright. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope to get a better view. What I saw makes my hands shake even now as I type this. It wasn't a bear, not even close. The creature was standing completely upright on two legs. It had grayish-brown fur covering its entire body, but the fur wasn't as thick or shaggy as a bear's. It was more uniform, almost like a short coat. The thing was tall, well over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7, with proportions that were disturbingly human-like but not human. The arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees, and the shoulders were massive, much broader than any man I've ever seen. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Through my scope, I could see it clearly. The eyes were huge, easily twice the size of human eyes, and set widely apart in a face that had no snout like a bear would. Instead, it had a flattish face with a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed those enormous eyes. I couldn't make out a distinct nose or mouth from that distance, just a darker area below the eyes. As I watched, frozen in place, the creature slowly turned its head and looked directly at me. I felt its gaze lock with mine through the scope, and in that moment, I experienced a fear so primal and deep that I nearly dropped my rifle. It wasn't just the fear of seeing something dangerous, it was the bone-deep terror of seeing something that shouldn't exist. Rex was now on the hood of my truck, barking frantically at the creature. He'd never jumped on my truck like that before, never. He was as scared as I was. The creature didn't move toward us. It just stood there, watching. That somehow made it worse. I had the distinct feeling it was sizing me up, deciding what to do. I've been face to face with angry bears, cornered coyotes, even a mountain lion once, but nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever made me feel the way that creature's stare did. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the rifle steady. I didn't want to shoot it, not out of compassion, but out of a strange certainty that wounding it would be the worst mistake of my life. Instead, I raised the barrel slightly and fired 2 shots into the air, hoping the noise would scare it off. The shots echoed through the mountains. The creature flinched at the sound but didn't run. Instead, it slowly turned its body to fully face me. That's when I noticed something else. Its stance. It stood with its knees slightly bent, feet planted wide apart, like a boxer ready to move in any direction. No bear stands like that. No animal I know stands like that. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we stayed locked in that standoff. Me with my rifle, Rex barking hysterically, and this thing watching us from 50 yards away. Then it moved. Not toward us, thankfully, but it shifted its weight and seemed to glance over its shoulder, as if checking something behind it. That movement broke my paralysis. I lunged for the truck door, yanked it open, and whistled for Rex. He practically flew off the hood and into the cab. I threw my rifle onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and reversed out of that clearing so fast I nearly hit a tree. I didn't stop to turn around until I'd backed up a good 100 yards down the logging road. As I spun the truck around, facing away from the clearing, I caught one last glimpse of the creature through the trees. It had moved to the edge of the clearing and was still watching me. Even from that distance, even through the trees and the dust kicked up by my tires, I could feel those eyes on me. I floored it. My old Ford bounced and rattled down that logging road faster than it was ever meant to go. Rex was pressed against me, trembling. I don't think I took a full breath until we hit the main forest road 20 minutes later. I drove straight back to my cabin, packed up my gear, and left the mountains that day, cutting my hunting trip short by 4 days. I told the guy at the gas station in the nearest town that I wasn't feeling well. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. Who would believe me? For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those eyes. Rex wouldn't leave my side for days, sleeping pressed against my leg instead of in his usual spot by the door. He knew what we'd seen wasn't natural. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I encountered that day. Could it have been a bear with some kind of deformity? A man in some elaborate costume? But this was 1973 in a remote part of the Sierras. Who would be wandering around in a costume that realistic? And why? The movements were too fluid, too natural for a costume anyway. It wasn't until 1975, when that famous footage of Bigfoot came out, the Patterson-Gimlin film, that I finally had a name for what I might have seen. The creature in that film moved differently than what I encountered, but the general size and shape were similar enough to make my blood run cold. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I never hunted alone after that day. A few years later, I gave up hunting altogether. I'd lost the peace I used to find in those mountains. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig would send my heart racing. Rex passed away in 1983, and after that, I sold all my hunting gear. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I've had 50 years to think about what I saw, and I still don't have a rational explanation. All I know is what I saw through that rifle scope wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't anything I can explain. Those eyes, that stance, the way it moved, it was something else entirely. The weirdest part? In all these years, I've never felt comfortable telling this story. Not because I'm afraid people will think I'm crazy, but because talking about it feels like inviting it back somehow. Like by acknowledging it, I might open some door that should stay closed. I still live in California, though I moved to the coast years ago. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick off the Pacific, I find myself scanning the tree line at the edge of my property. Just checking, always checking, because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you never stop looking for it. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in those mountains. And to be honest, I don't want to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 7. I've never told this story to anyone outside my closest family and the 3 friends who were with me that day. Even now, 25 years later, I get this cold feeling in my gut when I think about it. I'm only sharing this because I recently found out someone else had a similar experience in the same area last month, and I can't stop thinking about it. It was the summer of 1998. I was 10 years old, living in Jefferson County, Missouri, where my family had moved just a year before. I remember everything about that day with this weird, crystal-clear precision that most childhood memories don't have. It was late July, hot as hell, but not as humid as it usually gets there. My mum had dropped me and 3 friends off at French Pond for the day, Jake, Mikey, and Danny. We all lived in the same neighborhood and spent pretty much every day together that summer. French Pond wasn't anything special, just a small lake with a little gravelly beach area, some picnic tables, and woods surrounding most of it. But to us, it was this amazing wilderness to explore. We had our backpacks with snacks, water bottles, a couple of cheap walkie-talkies my dad had gotten me for my birthday, and these little pocket knives that made us feel like real explorers. We spent the morning swimming and messing around in the water. After lunch, we decided to go exploring in the woods. There were several trails that locals used for hiking, but we were feeling adventurous and decided to follow this narrow, less used path that curved away from the main trail and went deeper into the forest. The day had been perfectly normal up to that point. People at the beach area, birds singing, insects buzzing, all the typical summer forest sounds. We were laughing, shoving each other, talking about which Power Rangers were the best, normal kid stuff. I was leading our little expedition, with Jake behind me, then Mikey, with Danny bringing up the rear. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when everything changed. I don't know how else to describe it except to say that the forest just stopped. Not the trees or anything physical, the sound. 1 second the woods were alive with noise, birds, insects, distant voices from other hikers, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The next second, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing against your ears. I remember stopping in my tracks, and Jake bumped into me from behind. "Why'd you stop?" he asked, but even as he said it, I could see on his face that he felt it too. "Listen," I said. And we all did. Nothing. Completely nothing. I've been in quiet places before, but this was different. This was wrong. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. "Maybe there's a storm coming," Mikey suggested, but the sky was clear through the tree canopy. I felt nervous, but I was trying to act brave as the leader. "Let's keep going a little more," I said, "but stay close." We continued along the path, now walking in a tight, single file. Nobody was shoving or joking anymore. The path narrowed even more and curved around this massive old oak tree. As we got closer to the tree, I noticed a smell. At first it was faint, but with each step it got stronger, this awful stench of rotting meat mixed with wet dog fur, but worse. My eyes actually watered from how bad it was. I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose as we approached the curve in the trail. The others did the same. I remember Jake whispering, "What died?" But even as he said it, I had this feeling that whatever was causing that smell wasn't dead. I slowed down as we reached the big oak tree where the trail curved. Something felt very, very wrong. The silence was complete, the smell was overwhelming, and I had this pressure in my chest like right before you know something bad is about to happen. I took a deep breath through my shirt and stepped around the curve, and there it was, not 10 feet away from me, standing motionless in the middle of the path. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw. Part of me still tries to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was some homeless person in weird clothes. But I know what I saw. It was huge, at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in thick, matted fur that was a dark brown color, almost black in places. The fur looked dirty and tangled, with bits of leaves and twigs stuck in it. It wasn't like a bear's fur. It was longer, more like human hair, but all over its body. But the face is what still shows up in my nightmares. It wasn't an animal face, not completely. It had these deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. I couldn't see the color of the eyes, just dark shadows where they were. Its nose was flattish, almost human-like, but wider, and its mouth, I remember seeing teeth when its lips pulled back. Not fangs like a predator, but not human teeth either. Something in between. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I was completely frozen. I couldn't even scream. It seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Then it moved. It happened so fast. It turned its whole body toward me, tensing up like a spring. Its shoulders hunched forward, and it made this sound, not a roar or a growl, but this deep grunting noise that came from its chest. I could actually feel the vibration of it in my own chest, like when you stand too close to a big speaker. Then it dropped one arm low, near its hip, while raising the other one up to shoulder height. I remember thinking how weirdly human that gesture was, but also threatening, like it was getting ready to grab me. What happened next is what convinced me this wasn't a person in a costume or me misidentifying some normal animal. It stomped 1 foot, hard, into the ground. The whole earth beneath us shook, not like an earthquake, but like something so massive and powerful had just pounded the ground that the force traveled through the dirt under my feet. That's when I finally found my voice. "Run!" I screamed. already turning. I crashed into Jake, who had come up right behind me and had seen the thing too. His face was completely white. We didn't need to be told twice. All four of us turned and ran back the way we came, not caring about the path anymore. I remember branches whipping across my face, thorns catching on my clothes, roots trying to trip me. The only thought in my head was getting away from that thing. Behind us, I could hear it moving. Heavy footsteps, branches breaking, that horrible smell getting stronger as it pursued us. It was fast, much faster than it should have been for something that size. I was sure it was going to catch us. I was waiting for those long arms to grab me from behind, but after maybe 30 seconds of running, though it felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit suddenly stopped. We didn't. We kept running, crashing through the woods like terrified animals. At some point, we found one of the main trails and just followed it, running full speed back toward the beach area. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, where we all collapsed on the gravel, gasping for air. We were scratched up from branches, Danny had twisted his ankle, and Mikey had lost his backpack somewhere in the woods. But we were alive. It took several minutes before any of us could speak. Jake was the first one. What was that thing?" he panted. I shook my head. I didn't know what to say. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? "We can't tell anyone," Danny said suddenly. "They'll think we're crazy." We all looked at each other and nodded. It was a weird, unspoken agreement between us. We decided to say we got spooked by what we thought was a bear, and that's why we ran. It was the only explanation that made any sense. When my mom picked us up later that afternoon, she noticed right away that something was wrong. We were quiet, jumpy, and covered in scratches. I stuck to our bear story, and though she seemed skeptical, she didn't push it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face, those deep-set eyes staring at me. I kept my bedroom light on all night. The four of us never spoke about what really happened that day, not in any detail. Sometimes one of us would make a vague reference to that day at French Pond, and the others would just nod. We understood, but we never went back to those woods, and within a year, we had all drifted apart as friends. I've spent years researching, trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about strange creatures in Missouri folklore. Some descriptions match what we encountered, but nothing quite explains it all. The complete silence in the forest, that human-like face, the way it moved. What bothers me most is the thought that it might still be out there, that other kids might stumble across it like we did. That's why I'm breaking my silence now, after seeing that recent report from the same area. If you're hiking around French Pond in Jefferson County, stick to the main trails, stay in groups. And if the forest suddenly goes quiet, that unnatural, complete silence, turn around immediately and get out of there. Because I know what I saw that day wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in those woods. And 25 years later, I still wake up sometimes with that rotting meat smell in my nostrils and the sound of heavy footsteps right behind me. Story 8. I still have nightmares about what happened that day in November 2003. Most people laugh it off when I tell them, but Mark and I know what we saw. We were both 27 at the time, working dead-end jobs at the same warehouse outside Fayetteville. Neither of us had much going on in our lives. No girlfriends, no real plans for the future. Just two guys killing time on weekends by exploring the backwoods of North Carolina. That particular Saturday started like any other. It was unseasonably warm for late fall, maybe 65 degrees, with that golden late afternoon sun that makes everything look a bit magical. Mark picked me up around 4 in his beat-up Chevy S10, the same truck he'd had since high school. We'd heard about some abandoned railroad tracks that ran alongside the Cape Fear River, about 20 minutes outside town. Nothing special about them, just old industrial tracks that hadn't been used in decades, but we were always looking for new places to explore. We parked at this little gravel turnout, where the old access road met the highway. There wasn't another car in sight. The tracks were barely visible from the road, overgrown with weeds and half buried in places. I remember Mark joking that we'd probably get tetanus just from walking on them. We had a couple beers each before heading out, not enough to be drunk, just enough to take the edge off after a long work week. The tracks cut through dense woods before running parallel to the river. The trees were mostly bare by that point in the year, but there were still patches of red and orange leaves clinging to some of the oaks. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no people, just the occasional bird call and our footsteps crunching on the gravel between the railroad ties. We'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes, following the gentle curve of the tracks as they hugged the contour of the land. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Mark was a few steps ahead of me, pointing out a small concrete bridge up ahead where the tracks crossed over a creek that fed into the river. "Think it's still sturdy?" he asked, and I shrugged. We were maybe half a mile from where we'd parked. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a wild boar moving through the underbrush up on the hillside to our right. There was this heavy stomping sound, branches snapping, not the light, delicate movement of a smaller animal, but something big and heavy. Mark stopped and turned toward the sound. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I scanned the hillside, which rose maybe 40 or 50 feet above the tracks. The trees were spaced out enough that you could see between them, but there were still plenty of shadows as the sun dipped lower. Then I saw it. About 25 yards up the slope, partially hidden behind a thick oak tree, was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was huge, I mean absolutely massive, standing upright on two legs. My first thought was bear, but this was no bear. This thing was at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, with shoulders twice as broad as mine, and I'm not a small guy. It had one arm. No, not an arm. More like a limb that ended in what looked like a hand, wrapped around the trunk of the tree. Like it was using the tree as cover, but also like it was holding on for support. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, shaggy and thick, with slightly longer hair on its head that hung in matted clumps. But it was the face that made my blood turn to ice. Even in the fading light, even at that distance, I could see its face clearly. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It wasn't a snout or a muzzle. It was flat, almost human-like, but wrong. There was this heavy brow ridge that hung over deeply set eyes, so dark they looked like empty sockets. Its nose was wide and flat, and its mouth was this thin line, unnaturally straight for an animal. And it was staring right at us, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. "Thomas," Mark whispered beside me, his voice trembling. "What the fuck is that?" I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up completely. We stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. The creature didn't move, didn't blink, just kept its eyes locked on us while gripping that tree. Then Mark grabbed my arm. "Run!" he hissed. And we did. I've never run so fast in my life. We sprinted back along those tracks, stumbling over the uneven ties, not daring to look back. My lungs were burning, and my heart was hammering so hard I thought it would explode. I kept expecting to hear something crashing through the woods behind us, heavy footsteps gaining on us, but there was nothing, just our own panicked breathing and the sound of our boots on gravel. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. Mark fumbled with his keys, dropping them once before finally getting the door unlocked. We threw ourselves inside, and he cranked the engine, peeling out onto the highway so fast we left a cloud of dust behind us. For the first few miles, neither of us said a word. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying the image of that thing in my mind, the way it stood so still, how deliberately it seemed to be watching us. "Did you see its face?" Mark finally asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Yeah," I said. My mouth was so dry the word came out as a croak. That wasn't a bear, man. That wasn't anything I've ever seen. I know. What the hell was it? I didn't have an answer then. I still don't. Not really. But I know what it looked like. It looked like the thing people called Bigfoot, except everything I'd ever heard about Bigfoot made it sound almost gentle, curious. This thing, there was something predatory in the way it watched us. Something intelligent and calculating. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring at me from the shadows. I kept hearing noises outside my apartment window, probably just the normal sounds of the night, but my mind turned every rustling leaf into footsteps, every creaking branch into something trying to get in. I called my parents the next day. My dad had been a hunter all his life, knew every animal in those woods. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd have some explanation. But he just laughed when I told him what we'd seen. "You boys been drinking out there?" he asked. "A couple beers, Dad, that's it. We weren't drunk." "Well, there's no such thing as monsters, son. Probably just a black bear standing on its hind legs. They do that sometimes when they're curious." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "I've seen bears. This was something else." "Thomas," he said, his voice taking on that tone he used when he thought I was being ridiculous. "There's nothing in those woods that can't be explained. You got spooked, that's all." I stopped trying to convince him after that. Stopped telling anyone about it, really. The few people I did tell had the same reaction. Either I was making it up, or I'd seen a bear, or my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fading light. Mark and I talked about going back there in daylight, maybe with a camera, just to see if we could find any evidence. Footprints, hair, anything that would prove we weren't crazy. But when it came down to it, neither of us could bring ourselves to go back. The fear was too raw, too real. A week after it happened, Mark showed up at my door with a stack of printouts from the internet. Articles about Bigfoot sightings, theories about unidentified primates living in the forests of North America, even some stuff about missing lynx species that might have survived extinction. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one report from 1986 that described a sighting less than 20 miles from where we'd been. Same description, tall, hairy, human-like face, standing still, just watching. We spent hours going through those papers, finding connections, convincing ourselves that what we'd seen was real. But deep down, I didn't need convincing. I knew what I'd seen was real. The image was burned into my brain. Over the next few months, I started having these recurring nightmares. I'd be back on those tracks, alone this time. The sun would be setting, just like that day, but instead of seeing the creature up on the hillside, I'd feel something watching me from behind. In the dream, I'd try to run, but my legs would be like lead. And just before I'd wake up, I'd hear heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. Mark and I drifted apart after a while. He got a job offer in Tennessee the following year and moved away. Last I heard, he was married with kids, living a normal life. Sometimes I wonder if he still thinks about what we saw, if he still wakes up in a cold sweat from the same nightmares that plague me. I'm 48 now. I've got a decent job, a small house on the outskirts of town. To anyone looking in from the outside, I live a perfectly ordinary life, but I've never gone hiking in those woods again, never walked along a trail alone at dusk, never shaken the feeling that there are things out there we don't understand. I've spent years researching, trying to make sense of what we encountered. The closest explanation I can come up with is that it was some kind of surviving hominid species, something that evolved alongside humans, but took a different path. Maybe a branch of early humans that found a way to survive in the remote wilderness, hidden from civilization except for these rare, terrifying encounters. The Cape Fear River Basin has miles of dense, swampy forest that's barely been touched by development. It's the perfect hiding place for something that doesn't want to be found, something that's learned to stay in the shadows, to watch from a distance, to avoid human contact, except when curiosity gets the better of it. Sometimes I drive out to that highway and park near the turnout where we left the truck that day. I never get out, never walk those tracks again. I just sit there in my car, staring at the tree line, wondering if it's still out there, wondering if it remembers us the way we remember it. I know how this sounds. I know most people reading this will think I'm either lying or that I misidentified something ordinary. But Mark and I know what we saw that day. We know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a costume, wasn't a trick of the light or our imaginations running wild. It was real. It was watching us. And for all I know, it's still out there, standing perfectly still behind some tree, one arm wrapped around the trunk, waiting for the next unlucky hikers to wander down those abandoned tracks as the sun begins to set. Story 9. I've always been a bit of a rock hound. Nothing serious, just a hobby I picked up from my dad when I was a kid. Last summer, I was driving through a pretty remote area in Colorado, about 20 miles outside of Woodland Park. I'd heard about this quartz outcrop from a geology forum I'm on, and since I had the day off, I figured I'd check it out. The drive there was peaceful. It was a Tuesday in mid-July, around 1 in the afternoon. Not another car in sight as I turned onto this narrow dirt road that wound up into the foothills. I parked in a small clearing near the trailhead, grabbed my backpack with water and some basic tools, and headed out. The spot wasn't marked on any tourist maps, just a local secret shared among rock collectors. It took about 15 minutes of hiking through pretty dense pine forest before the trees opened up to reveal this amazing white outcrop jutting out of the hillside. The quartz deposit was bigger than I expected, maybe 40 feet tall at its highest point, with beautiful clear crystals catching the sunlight. I spent the next 45 minutes or so just exploring, taking pictures, and collecting a few small specimens. Nothing too big. I'm not one of those people who tears up natural formations. Just a couple of nice hand-sized pieces with good clarity. The whole time I felt, I don't know, peaceful. It was quiet except for the occasional bird and the wind in the pines. I remember thinking how nice it was to be completely alone in nature. That feeling didn't last. I decided to head back to my car around 2:30. The sun was still high, but I wanted to get back to town before dinner. I followed the narrow path around the side of the outcrop, and as I came around this big boulder, my car came into view about 100 yards away. Something was wrong. I noticed it immediately. The windshield wipers on my Honda were flipped outward. Not just moved a little, they were completely flipped around, so the rubber part was facing out instead of against the glass. Both of them. I stopped dead in my tracks. My first thought was, did I leave them like that? But I knew I hadn't. They were completely normal when I parked. My second thought was, maybe it was kids. But I hadn't seen another person for miles, and there were no other cars or signs of people. My heart started beating faster. I was suddenly very aware that I was alone in a remote area, and someone or something had been messing with my car while I was exploring the outcrop. I scanned the area around my car instinctively. The forest edge was about 40 feet beyond my car, a wall of dark green pines and shadows. That's when I saw it. In the dense patch of trees directly across from my vehicle, there was something solid. At first I thought it was a black bear. That would make sense. Bears are curious and might investigate a strange object like a car. It was just a dark mass, low to the ground, maybe crouched or sitting. But it wasn't moving like a bear would. It was completely still, and it seemed to be looking directly at me. I'm not a hunter or wildlife expert, but I've encountered bears before while hiking. They usually move around, sniffing or pawing at things. This thing was just watching, perfectly still. The stillness was what made my skin crawl. I didn't have many options. My car was between me and whatever was in the trees, and I needed to get to it. I decided to walk slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure the whole time. I didn't run. Something told me that would be a bad idea. Every step felt like it took forever. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the crunch of my boots on the rocky soil, my own breathing, which was getting heavier. I kept my eyes locked on that dark shape in the trees, trying to make out details, but it was too shadowed. As I got closer to my car, I started fumbling for my keys in my pocket. I had them gripped so tight my knuckles were white. When I finally reached the driver's side door, I was between my car and whatever was watching me. I carefully opened the door, trying not to make sudden movements. I slipped into the driver's seat, still watching that patch of forest through the passenger window. I closed the door and locked it in one motion. The sound of the door slamming shut seemed to echo in the quiet forest. And that's when everything changed. The figure stood up. I still get chills thinking about it. What rose from that crouched position wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I recognized. It stood up on two legs and kept going up and up. It had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. It looked vaguely like a man, bipedal with arms and legs, but was covered entirely in black hair or fur, not shaggy like a bear, but more like a smooth, dark coat. It wasn't bulky like a grizzly. It was lean but powerfully built, with proportions similar to a human, but not quite right. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, the head was somewhat domed, not like a person's. I sat there frozen, my hands still on the keys I'd just put in the ignition. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was looking right at me. I don't remember seeing eyes, just that its face, if you could call it that, was pointed directly at me. I finally snapped out of it and started the engine. The creature's head tilted slightly at the sound, almost like it was curious. Then, before I could even shift into reverse, it moved. God, the way it moved. I've never seen anything move like that. It turned and bolted south through the trees, not lumbering like a bear, not bounding like a deer. It ran with this unnatural smoothness, almost gliding, yet incredibly fast. It ran along the inside edge of the forest, parallel to the clearing, and then up, actually up, the side of the quartz outcrop I'd just been exploring. The whole thing, from its standing up to disappearing from sight, couldn't have taken more than 6 seconds. But those 6 seconds are burned into my memory in slow motion. I slammed the car into reverse, spun around, and got the hell out of there. I drove way too fast down that dirt road, not caring about the rocks hitting my undercarriage or the branches scraping my paint. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop until I reached Woodland Park. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and just sat there for a minute, trying to process what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. I finally got out to flip my windshield wipers back to their normal position. They were completely intact, just turned the wrong way, like someone had deliberately flipped them as some kind of message or warning. That's when another thought hit me. That thing had probably been watching me the entire time I was at the outcrop. I'd spent nearly an hour exploring, taking pictures, completely oblivious to the fact that something was observing me from the shadows. I tried to rationalize it on the drive home. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't stand that tall, and they don't move like that. A person in a costume, out in the middle of nowhere, with no vehicles around, and no person could move that fast or climb that outcrop like it did. I've gone back and forth about whether I should report this to anyone. I mean, who would I even tell? The park rangers? Excuse me, I saw a giant hairy humanoid playing with my windshield wipers. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. I've researched local wildlife extensively since then. Nothing matches what I saw. I've also looked into other explanations. Bigfoot sightings, skinwalker stories, all that stuff I used to laugh at. I'm not laughing anymore. The thing that gets me the most, looking back, is that it didn't seem aggressive. It could have approached me while I was absorbed in collecting rocks, but it didn't. It just watched. And when I got to my car, it ran away. Maybe it was just curious. But curious or not, There was something deeply unnerving about the whole experience, like being observed by something that shouldn't exist. I haven't gone rock hunting alone since then, and I always check my windshield wipers before I leave my car anywhere, even in the middle of town. Call it paranoia, but after what I saw, I don't think I'm taking any chances. Sometimes at night, I still think about those 6 seconds, watching something impossible move with such fluid grace through the trees and up that rocky slope. And I wonder if it's still out there watching other people who have no idea they're being observed. Story 10. I'm 33 now, but I still can't shake what happened to me when I was 10. Most days, I don't think about it, but when storms roll in or when I'm alone in the dark, it all comes flooding back. I grew up in South Dakota, right near the Nebraska border, in what I can only describe as the middle of nowhere. Our house sat at the bottom of a hill, right on a small beach area next to a river. The isolation was intense. The nearest town was 25 miles away, and our closest neighbors were about 3 miles down the road. My parents loved it there. Dad worked from home as a software developer, which was pretty unusual back then, and Mom was a writer. They chose that spot because they wanted peace and quiet. As a kid, I mostly enjoyed it too. We had 3 dogs, Duke, a German Shepherd, Bailey, a lab mix, and Sadie, a little terrier thing. They were my constant companions in a place where other kids weren't exactly around the corner. This happened in winter when I was in 5th grade. South Dakota winters are brutal. The kind where the wind cuts right through you and the cold makes your lungs hurt when you breathe. This particular day started with one of the worst storms I'd ever seen. I remember waking up around 1:30 in the afternoon. I'd slept in because school was cancelled, to the sound of wind absolutely howling against my window. The sky was this weird dark grey colour, and snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the trees outside. I've always been terrified of storms. Even now, as a grown woman, I get anxious when the weather turns. But back then, pure terror. When I heard how bad it was, I immediately wanted my parents. Their bedroom was at the back of our house, with this big window that overlooked the river below and the dense tree-covered hills about 20 meters away. I remember walking down our hallway, the wood floors creaking under my feet. The house was this old place built in the 70s, all wood paneling and weird angles. As I got closer to their room, I noticed it was unusually cold in the hallway. When I pushed open their door, I saw both my parents still fast asleep. Dad was snoring like usual, and Mom was curled up with her back to him. The digital clock on their nightstand read 1:37 in bright red numbers. What immediately struck me as weird was that their window was cracked open, just a few inches, but enough to let in freezing air. Who leaves a window open during a South Dakota blizzard? I walked over to their bed, stepping carefully across the cold wooden floor. "Mom," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. She didn't budge. I tried again, a little harder. Nothing. It was strange because Mom was usually a light sleeper. I turned to Dad and gave his arm a push. He just kept snoring. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from outside the window. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but there was something deliberate about it, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I moved toward the window thinking maybe one of our dogs had somehow gotten out. Duke was protective and sometimes patrolled around the house during storms. The window overlooked the backyard, which sloped down toward the river and then across to the heavily wooded hills. The storm was still raging in the distance, but right around our house, everything had gone eerily quiet. I stood on my tiptoes to see better out the window. The snow was falling more gently now, almost floating down in big flakes. That's when I saw them, a pair of glowing red eyes staring directly at me from the edge of the woods. My whole body went cold. These weren't animal eyes reflecting light. They were actually glowing, like 2 burning coals in the grey afternoon light. I couldn't make out what they belonged to. The creature was partially hidden among the trees, but I could see movement, something big shifting its weight. The eyes were high off the ground, maybe 6 or 7 feet up. I stood frozen, unable to look away. The creature moved slightly, branches and underbrush rustling. I could hear its footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, crunching in the snow. Not like a deer or even a bear, something different. The eyes never left mine, like it was studying me just as intensely as I was studying it. Then it took a step forward, just partially out of the tree line, and although I still couldn't make out its full body in the dim light and swirling snow, I could tell it was massive. Not just tall, but broad. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. Then it made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite anything I'd ever heard before. Low and rumbling, but almost purposeful, like it was trying to communicate. I remember pressing myself against the wall next to the window, wanting to run but unable to move. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned away. I watched those glowing eyes swing away from me as the creature moved down the hill toward the river. I could hear its heavy footsteps fading, branches breaking under its weight as it descended. I finally found my voice and turned back to my parents. "Mom, Dad, there's something outside." I was practically screaming, but they didn't even stir. I ran to their bed and shook them both hard. Nothing. It was like they were under some kind of spell. I was completely terrified, trapped between the fear of whatever was outside and the bizarre situation with my parents. I ended up crawling into their bed, pulling the covers over my head and crying silently. I must have eventually fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion and fear. When I woke up a couple hours later, my parents were both awake and acting completely normal. Mom was making hot chocolate in the kitchen, and Dad was trying to shovel some of the snow away from our front door. The storm had mostly passed. "Why was your window open during the storm?" I asked Mom when she handed me a mug. She looked confused. "It wasn't, honey. We'd never leave a window open in this weather." "Yes, it was. I came into your room during the storm, and it was open. I saw something outside." The words tumbled out of me as I told them about the glowing eyes, the massive creature, how they wouldn't wake up. Dad exchanged a look with Mom, that parent look that says kids and their imaginations. "Emma, you probably just had a bad dream," Mom said gently. "Or maybe you saw one of the neighbor's cows that wandered too far. It happens sometimes." "It wasn't a cow. Cows don't have glowing red eyes, and they don't stand that tall." Dad patted my shoulder. "Honey, there are all kinds of explanations. Could have been a deer, and its eyes were reflecting light from somewhere, or maybe an elk. They can be pretty big." But I knew what I saw. Nothing around here had eyes like that, and nothing moved the way that thing moved. What really bothered me was that none of our dogs had barked, not once. Duke especially was hyper-vigilant. He'd bark if a squirrel got too close to the house, let alone a massive unknown creature. But all 3 dogs had been quiet all night. When I went to check on them, they were all huddled together in the laundry room where they slept, wide awake but completely silent. They wouldn't come when I called them, which was completely out of character. After breakfast, I bundled up and went outside to look for tracks. The snow had mostly stopped, but a fresh layer covered everything. I trudged around to the back of the house below my parents' window. There were no unusual footprints, just some scattered deer tracks near the tree line. I walked toward the woods where I'd seen the eyes, feeling both scared and determined. The temperature had dropped even further, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. The trees stood silent and heavy with snow. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, it was hard to believe what I'd seen just hours before. At the edge of the woods, I stopped. Something felt wrong about going any further. A feeling of being watched crept over me, and I hurried back to the house. For weeks after, I refused to sleep alone. I kept looking out windows, expecting to see those eyes again. I started having nightmares where I'd wake up to find the creature standing at the foot of my bed, those burning red eyes boring into me. But nothing happened. life went on. My parents eventually got tired of my story. Mom suggested that maybe I'd been sleepwalking or had some kind of waking nightmare. Dad said I'd been watching too many scary movies, which wasn't true. They were super strict about that stuff. After a while, I stopped bringing it up because I could tell they thought I was either making it up for attention or that something was wrong with me. But I know what I saw. And what still haunts me to this day is how my parents wouldn't wake up, how our always alert dog stayed silent, how that thing looked at me with what felt like intelligence, like it knew me, like it had come specifically to our isolated house in the middle of a snowstorm for a reason. We moved away from that house 2 years later when Dad got a new job. I was secretly relieved, though I never told my parents that. I've never seen anything like that creature again, and honestly, I hope I never do. But sometimes when storms come and the wind starts howling, I find myself checking that all my windows are closed tight, pulling the curtains shut, and trying not to think about what might be out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. I still can't explain what happened that day. Was it real? Was it some kind of hallucination? I don't know, but those eyes, those glowing red eyes, they were real to me. And somewhere deep down, I know that whatever I saw that snowy afternoon is still out there somewhere. Story 11. I've never told many people about what happened to me that day in April of '73. Most folks just laugh it off or think I'm making it up, but I swear on everything I care about, what I saw was real, and it still gives me chills thinking about it all these years later. I was 17 then, just a regular high school kid in Lancaster, California. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was driving my dad's old Chevy pickup down Avenue J to our family ranch. We lived a ways out of town, where the desert starts to take over. This was back when Lancaster still had plenty of open space, not like today with all the development. The day was crystal clear, one of those perfect spring afternoons where you can see for miles across the desert. Not too hot yet, maybe around 70 degrees. The sun was still pretty high, I'd say around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. I remember I had the windows down and could smell the creosote bushes that release that distinctive desert smell when it warms up. I was probably doing about 45 miles per hour down Avenue J. Back then, it wasn't the busy road it is now, just a straight shot through scrubby desert with those burned black Joshua trees dotting the landscape. They'd had a wildfire out that way the previous summer, so a lot of the vegetation was still charred and black. I was thinking about homework and this girl I liked in my English class, not really paying close attention to the roadside. That's when I first noticed it, what I initially thought was just another one of those burned trees. But something about it caught my eye. It was too solid, too dark, and then it moved. My heart literally skipped a beat. I remember my hands tightening on the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. About 50 yards ahead, standing just off the side of the road, was this figure. I slowed down, not believing what I was seeing at first. I thought maybe it was someone in dark clothes, but as I got closer, I realized it was way too big to be a person. This thing was huge. I'd estimate around 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. But what really struck me wasn't just the height, it was how it was built. It had this bizarre silhouette, a peaked head that looked almost like a bullet or cone on top, sloping down into these massive, massive shoulders. The proportions were all wrong. Its head seemed too small for its body, which was just enormous, thick and powerful looking. And the hair, God, the hair. It was covered from head to toe in this thick black hair. Not fur exactly, more like a shaggy human hair, but all over its body. The color was this deep, matte black that almost absorbed the sunlight. Not shiny at all. In some places, it looked matted and rough. As I got closer, maybe 30 yards away now, the thing became aware of me. This is the part that still haunts me. It didn't turn its head to look at me like a person or animal would. The entire upper half of its body rotated, all in one piece, like some kind of military tank turret. It was the most unnatural movement I've ever seen, fluid but wrong, like its torso wasn't constructed the same way ours are. Its head and shoulders moved as one solid unit. I could see its face now, though not clearly. It was dark, partially obscured by all that hair, but I could make out what looked like deep-set eyes. I couldn't see any white in them. They were just these dark hollows in its face. I don't remember seeing a nose, just a somewhat flattened area where a nose should be. I couldn't make out a mouth in all that hair. By now I'd slowed to maybe 20 miles per hour. I was terrified but also mesmerized. I couldn't look away. We were making eye contact, or at least I felt like we were. There was intelligence there. This wasn't some animal. It was observing me, assessing me. I was close enough now that I could see how the hair on its shoulders moved slightly in the breeze. That detail has always stuck with me, the way the hair shifted, proving this was a real physical thing standing there, not a hallucination or a shadow. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. Without any visible preparation or bending of knees like a human would do, this thing just leaped. One massive stride that cleared the entire width of Avenue J, which had to be at least 20 feet across at that point. 1 second it was on the left side of the road, the next it was disappearing into the scrubby vegetation on the right. The power in that movement was incredible. It didn't seem to exert any effort. It was like watching someone step over a small puddle, except it was clearing an entire road. The stride was smooth, almost graceful despite the creature's bulk. I hit the brakes and sat there in the middle of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible, but another part, the stupid, curious teenage part, wanted to investigate. After sitting there for maybe a minute, just trying to process what happened, I pulled over to the side of the road where the thing had been standing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the truck in park. I sat there for another minute scanning the desert, but I couldn't see any sign of the creature. I finally worked up the courage to get out. The desert was silent except for the ticking of my truck's cooling engine and the slight whistle of wind through the Joshua trees. I walked to the spot where I'd seen it standing and immediately noticed the ground was disturbed. There, pressed into the sandy soil, was the clearest footprint I've ever seen. It was enormous. I put my boot next to it for comparison, and it made my size 10 look like a child's shoe. The print had to be 18 inches long at least, and about 8 inches across at the widest part. I could clearly make out 5 toes, spread wider apart than human toes would be. The impression was deep too. Whatever made it had to be incredibly heavy. I found another print about 6 feet away. Then nothing. It was as if the thing had just vanished. I looked toward where it had jumped to, across the road, but I was too afraid to go investigate that side. Something about this encounter had me deeply unsettled. More than just the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist. It was the way it had looked at me, with what felt like intelligence and purpose. I got back in my truck and drove straight home, probably 20 miles over the speed limit the whole way. When I got to the ranch, I ran inside and told my dad what I'd seen. He's always been a practical, no-nonsense kind of guy, but to his credit, he didn't dismiss me outright. He could see I was genuinely shaken. "You sure it wasn't just a bear standing up?" he asked. "Dad, bears don't clear 20-foot roads in a single step," I said. "And they don't have bullet-shaped heads and rotate their entire upper bodies like some kind of machine." He suggested we go back with his Polaroid camera, but by the time we returned to the spot an hour later, the wind had already started erasing the footprints. They were still visible, but not as clear as when I'd first seen them. Dad took some photos anyway, but they didn't really capture what I'd seen. Just some vague depressions in the sand that could have been anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that thing's dark silhouette against the desert landscape, the unnatural way it moved. I wondered if it was still out there, watching our ranch from the darkness. The next day at school, I told a couple of friends, but I could tell from their reactions that they thought I was either lying or had seen a shadow or oddly shaped Joshua tree. One suggested I'd seen a homeless person. A homeless person 8 feet tall with a peaked head? Yeah, right. What's strange is that over the next few weeks, I heard rumors about other sightings along Avenue J and in the surrounding desert areas. A truck driver claimed to have seen something similar crossing the road near dawn. An old prospector type who lived out in a trailer said something had circled his home one night, making strange grunting noises. I started researching, reading everything I could about Bigfoot sightings. Most of the famous ones were from the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Northern California. Not many people were talking about Bigfoot in the Southern California deserts. But the descriptions from other sightings matched what I'd seen in many ways. The height, the hair, the footprints. What didn't match was the head shape. Most Bigfoot reports described a round, dome-shaped head, sometimes with a sagittal crest. What I saw had that distinct conical or bullet-shaped top that sloped directly into the shoulders with barely any neck. And I've never read another account that mentioned that bizarre rotating upper torso movement. I went back to that spot many times over the next few months, hoping to see it again or find more evidence. I never did, though once I thought I heard something large moving through the brush in the distance. I got spooked and left immediately. For years, I've wondered what exactly I saw that day. Was it some unknown species? A deformed bear, though we rarely get bears in the Lancaster area? Some kind of government experiment? I've gone through all the possibilities in my mind, but nothing fits as well as the simplest explanation that there are things living in the wild places of our world that we don't understand and haven't properly documented. I'm 41 now, and I've told this story maybe 5 times in my life. I've never gone public with it or reported it to any official Bigfoot research groups. I just keep it to myself, this strange experience that changed how I view the world. I still live in Southern California, but I moved closer to the city. I tell myself it's for work, but honestly, I've never felt completely comfortable in the desert again after that day. Sometimes when I visit my parents, who still live on that ranch, I find myself staring out at the desert at dusk, wondering if it's still out there, wondering if it remembers me the way I remember it. It's been over 20 years now, but I can still see every detail of that encounter like it happened yesterday. The bullet-shaped head, the unnatural rotation, that impossible leap across Avenue J. I don't know what I saw that April afternoon in '73, but I know it was real. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the Antelope Valley, I could swear I hear something moving out there in the desert, something too big to be explained away by conventional science. Story 12. I still get chills when I think about that night in August 2006. It's been 18 years, but the memory is as fresh as if it happened yesterday. I've never shared this experience online before, but I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. My daughter Lily and I were visiting my cousin Janet in Parksville on Vancouver Island that summer. Lily had just turned 2 in June, and it was our first real trip together since her father and I split up. Janet has this beautiful property on the edge of the forest, not deep in the wilderness or anything, but definitely where civilization starts to thin out. The yard backs right up against the trees with this tall wooden fence surrounding it. That night, Janet suggested we camp in her yard. It seemed like a fun idea. Lily was going through this phase where she was obsessed with tents, and I thought it would be a nice memory for us. Janet had this small 2-person tent she set up for us on the far side of her yard, maybe 30 feet from the house. It was a warm night, stars were out, and Lily was so excited about our adventure. We roasted marshmallows with Janet on her deck earlier that evening, and Lily fell asleep quickly after all the excitement. I remember lying there in our sleeping bags, listening to her tiny, rhythmic breathing and feeling so content. I must have drifted off around 11. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up, My phone was charging inside the house, but it was that deep part of night when everything is absolutely silent. You know, that stillness that feels almost heavy. That's what it was like until I heard it. At first, I thought I was dreaming. It was a faint sound coming from the direction of Janet's house. Click, 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 like someone tapping a pen on a table, but more deliberate. It took me a few seconds to realize the sound was coming from Janet's wooden deck. Click, click, click. Something was walking across it. My first thought was that Janet had let her dog out, but then I remembered she didn't have a dog. Click, click, click. Whatever it wasn't moving randomly. The clicks were steady, measured, like it was moving with purpose. I lay completely still, suddenly wide awake, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. The clicking stopped at the edge of the deck, and I heard a soft thump as whatever it was jumped or stepped down onto the grass. My mouth went dry as I realized the sound was now heading directly toward our tent. The footsteps were nearly silent on the grass, but I could sense the movement, feel the slight vibrations in the ground. Then I heard something else that made my blood turn to ice. Breathing. Not heavy panting like a dog, but slow, controlled, breathing, the kind that suggests intelligence. I instinctively pulled Lily closer to me, trying to move as slowly and silently as possible. She stirred slightly but didn't wake up. I was terrified she might start crying if she woke suddenly. Every muscle in my body tensed as the footsteps stopped directly outside our tent. There was a moment of complete silence, and then I heard it. A slow, deliberate sniff. Not a quick snuffle like an animal catching a random scent, but a long, deep inhalation, as if whatever was out there was trying to memorize our scent. The fabric of the tent moved slightly, like something was pressing against it. Not hard, just enough to make the material shift inward. Another sniff, longer this time. Then I felt rather than heard it move around the tent, stopping at different points to sniff again. It circled us completely, pausing longest at the area where our heads were. The tent wall brushed against my hair at one point, and it took everything I had not to scream. Whatever was out there, it wasn't behaving like any animal I'd encountered before. Bears investigate for food, and they're usually noisy and clumsy. This was methodical, purposeful. It felt like it was hunting, but not in a rushed way, like it had all the time in the world. I remember thinking about the zipper of the tent, how thin that barrier was between us and whatever was outside. My entire body was trembling, but I forced myself to remain motionless. I was terrified that any movement would provoke it. I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric, just the vague outline of something darker than the night sky when it moved between us and the distant porch light. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sniffing stopped. There was a pause, and then I heard the footsteps moving away from the tent back toward the deck. Click, click, click. The sound returned as it climbed back onto the wooden surface. As soon as I thought it was far enough away, I fumbled for my phone before remembering it wasn't with me. I was shaking so badly I could barely think straight. I glanced at Lily, still miraculously asleep, her little face peaceful in the dim light. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear at the thought of leaving the tent. Finally, when I could no longer hear the clicking, I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, just enough to peek out. The yard was empty as far as I could see, but the shadows were deep, and the trees beyond the fence were just a wall of darkness. I zipped it back up immediately and sat there trying to slow my breathing. My mind was racing. Janet had a landline in the house. Could I make it there safely? Should I try to carry Lily? What if that thing was still out there, waiting? I decided to leave Lily in the tent and make a run for it alone. The house was locked, but I knew where Janet kept the spare key. I steeled myself, took a deep breath and unzipped the tent again. The cool night air hit my face as I slipped out, immediately scanning the yard and deck. Nothing. I closed the tent behind me and ran across the yard as fast and quietly as I could, my bare feet soundless on the grass. I found the key, let myself in, and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered frantically, explaining there was something outside our tent. I asked if they could call my cousin's number to wake her up so she could turn on the outside lights. I was afraid to make noise by yelling for her myself. The dispatcher was calm, said they'd send someone right away and would contact Janet. Less than a minute later, the yard flooded with light as Janet turned on every exterior light. I saw her peering out the window, phone in hand, looking confused and concerned. I waved to her from the kitchen, and she came downstairs to let me in. After quickly explaining what happened, we both went to get Lily, who was still somehow sleeping through the whole ordeal. Janet insisted we stay, in her RV parked in the driveway for the rest of the night, which had a solid metal door with a good lock. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the property and surrounding area, but found nothing. They suggested it was probably a bear or cougar, common enough in the area. I nodded and thanked them, but something didn't sit right with me. That night in the RV, I couldn't sleep. Janet had gone back to the house after the police left, saying she felt safe with them, having checked everything. But as I lay there next to Lily, I kept replaying what had happened. It wasn't until the next morning, as we were packing up to leave early, I decided we were going to stay in a hotel for the remainder of our trip, that I really thought about the fence. Janet's backyard had this 6-foot wooden fence all around it. How would a bear or cougar have gotten in so easily and left without a trace? There were no claw marks, no damaged sections, and the clicking sound on the deck, that wasn't like any bear or cougar I'd ever heard. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The methodical way it moved, the deliberate sniffing, the fact that it seemed to focus on where our heads were. Bears don't do that. They don't investigate with such intent. We left that day, and I've never camped again, not even in a backyard. Lily doesn't remember any of it, thankfully. She's 19 now and thinks I'm just being dramatic when I refuse to go camping. I've spent years trying to convince myself it was just a bear, but deep down, I know it wasn't. The way it moved, the intelligence it seemed to possess. It was hunting, but not for food. It was looking for something specific. It was looking for us. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear that clicking sound on my apartment balcony. I've lived in the city for years now, as far from forests as I can get, but the fear never really goes away. What was it that found us that night? And why did it leave without doing anything? These questions haunt me, but maybe the most terrifying question is, what if it's still out there, remembering our scent, waiting for another chance to find us? I've never told anyone this part before, but the thing that disturbs me most is what happened the next morning. As we were packing up the tent, I found 3 long, dark hairs stuck to the outside fabric, right where whatever it was had pressed against the tent. They weren't bear hairs, too long, almost like human hair, but coarser. I put them in a plastic bag, intending to show them to someone who might identify them, but in the rush to leave and my state of mind, I lost track of the bag. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined those hairs, but then I remember the sound of those nails clicking on the deck, and I know I didn't imagine that. Whatever found us that night wasn't anything I can explain, and it's the not knowing that keeps me up at night. Story 13. I've never been much of a writer, but I need to get this out somewhere. I've been sitting on this for almost 2 years now, and it's driving me crazy not having answers. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or has some insight. I live on Vancouver Island in a pretty rural area. It's beautiful here. I've got a few acres backing onto dense forest, and I run a small animal rescue. Nothing fancy, just taking in animals that need homes. Right now, I've got about 30 animals, some horses, goats, a few dogs, cats, even a couple rabbits and chickens. It's peaceful most of the time, or at least it was until about 2 years ago. The first incident happened in late October. My friends Jenna and Mike were visiting. and we were walking along the edge of my horse field around dusk. We were just chatting, enjoying the evening air, when something caught my eye at the far end of the field. At first I thought it was a deer, but the movement was all wrong. This thing was running on two legs, fast, unnaturally fast. It had this black silhouette and what looked like spiky, messy hair sticking up all over its head. We all stopped dead in our tracks. "Did you guys see that?" I whispered. They both nodded, eyes wide. We were too far away to make out any details, but whatever it was disappeared into the tree line within seconds. "What the hell was that?" Mike asked. None of us had an answer. We debated going to check it out, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. We decided to head back to the house instead. I told myself it was probably just someone trespassing, maybe a teenager cutting through my property. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain what we saw. The figure was strange, but what came after was even weirder. About a week later, I started hearing noises at night. Not just any noises, it was like, I started calling it the Peanut Gallery, because it felt almost performative, like something was putting on a show. I'd hear owl hoots, but they'd be slightly off, too rhythmic or at strange intervals. Then dog barks that didn't sound quite right, followed by cat meows that were a little too human-like. Sometimes there were even sounds like monkeys chattering, which makes absolutely no sense on Vancouver Island. The worst were these howls that didn't match any animal I know of. Not wolves, not coyotes, nothing local. What made it creepier was the pattern. These sounds always started around 10 at night and would go on intermittently until about 3 in the morning. And they only happened in fall and winter. During spring and summer, everything was normal. Speaking of seasonal changes, my animals started acting differently too. My dogs love exploring the woods behind the house during summer. They'd spend hours back there sniffing around, but once fall hit, I couldn't get them to go near the tree line. They'd plant their feet and refuse to move, or they'd turn around and head back to the house. The cats were the same way. They'd sit at the edge of the yard, staring into the woods, their tails twitching nervously. Last November, I was walking through my property collecting some firewood when I got this overwhelming feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, it was this heavy physical sensation on the back of my neck. I kept scanning the trees, turning around suddenly hoping to catch whatever was observing me. Nothing was ever there, at least nothing I could see. But the feeling was so intense, I actually started carrying bear spray with me on my own property. The thing is, I'm not easily spooked. I've lived rurally most of my life, and I'm used to wildlife. But this was different. This felt intelligent, calculating. One evening in December, I was walking along the back edge of my property where it meets the forest. The sun was setting early, as it does in winter here, and I was hurrying to finish checking my fence line before dark. That's when I smelled it. This powerful, foul odor that seemed to hit me all at once. It wasn't like decay or anything rotting. It was musky, like a dirty animal smell, but stronger than anything I'd encountered before, not like a skunk or bear or anything familiar. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I stood there frozen, listening. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no rustling, nothing. Just absolute stillness and that horrible smell. I backed away slowly and went straight back to the house. I didn't run, though every instinct told me to. Something told me running would be a bad idea. My property setup probably makes it ideal for whatever this is. The forest behind me stretches for miles with no interruption, and there's a power line corridor that cuts right through it. Those power lines create what's basically a highway for wildlife. A clear path lined with blackberry brambles that offers cover but easy movement. Almost no one goes back there except occasional utility workers. And hunting isn't allowed near the power lines for safety reasons, so any animals using that corridor are relatively undisturbed. With my animal rescue, I go through a lot of feed. I store it in a shed near the back of my property, big bins of grain, hay, and various animal foods. In January, I started noticing odd things in my feed area. Nothing dramatic, no broken locks or torn-up bags, but subtle things that made me uneasy. A lid left slightly open when I know I'd closed it tight. A bin not sealed the way I left it. Feed scattered in places it shouldn't be. What's weird is that if it were bears or raccoons, they'd make a mess. They'd tear things apart to get at the food. This was different, almost careful, like something was trying not to leave evidence it had been there. I set up a trail camera by the feed shed in February. I was determined to catch whatever was messing with my supplies. The first 2 weeks, nothing unusual showed up, just me going in and out, a few raccoons nearby but not getting into anything. Then one night, the camera failed. When I checked it the next morning, the batteries were dead, though I'd just replaced them 2 days earlier. That night, more feed had been disturbed. I replaced the batteries and tried again. 3 days later, same thing. Dead batteries and signs something had been in the feed shed. I tried a different camera. This time, the memory card was corrupted when I tried to view the footage. By this point, I was getting seriously freaked out. In early March, I was in the house around midnight when the peanut gallery started up again. First, owl hoots, 3 in a row, evenly spaced. Then some dog-like barking, but with this weird cadence to it. Then what sounded like a cat in heat, but slightly off. I decided I'd had enough and grabbed my flashlight to go investigate. I know, stupid move, right? But I was tired of being afraid in my own home. I stepped out onto my back porch and swept the tree line with my light. Nothing. The sound stopped. Immediately when I turned on the flashlight, I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just listening and watching. The silence was almost worse than the noises. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of movement about 50 yards away, right at the edge of where my property meets the forest. Something tall and dark shifted between 2 trees. I called out, "Hello, who's there?" My voice sounded so small in the darkness. No response, but the air felt charged suddenly, like right before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled all over. I raised my flashlight again, trying to find whatever I'd seen, but it was gone, or hidden. I had the distinct impression it was still there, watching me from the shadows, just out of the beam of my light. I backed into my house and locked the door. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking I heard scratching at the walls or footsteps on my porch, but when I'd check, there was nothing. The next morning, I found prints in the soft ground near where I'd seen the movement. They were weird, kind of elongated, bigger than human footprints, but not shaped like any animal tracks I recognized. They disappeared about 10 feet in, where the ground got harder. Spring came, and just like the previous year, everything went back to normal. The noises stopped. My animals ventured into the woods again. The feeling of being watched faded. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or exaggerated normal wildlife behavior into something sinister. Then September rolled around. The days got shorter, the nights cooler, and last week I heard it again. The owl hoots that aren't quite right, followed by those mimicked animal sounds. The peanut gallery is back. My neighbor mentioned the other day that several people in the area have reported unusual sounds at night. One guy about 2 miles from me said something big walked across his roof one night, but disappeared before he could get outside. Another family found their bird feeders, emptied and bent, hung about 7 feet off the ground. I've lived with wildlife my whole life. I know what bears do, what cougars sound like, how raccoons behave. This is something else. The way it mimics sounds, the seasonal pattern, the careful investigation of my feed supplies. It feels deliberate, intelligent, and the fact that it only happens in fall and winter makes me think it migrates or hibernates or changes its behavior seasonally. Tonight I'm sitting here with my doors locked, listening to those sounds starting up again in the distance. The peanut gallery performing its strange concert. My dogs are huddled at my feet, refusing to go out for their evening bathroom break. Even my most fearless cat is hiding under the bed, I don't know what's out there in the woods behind my house. I don't know if it's dangerous or just curious. But I know it's real, and it's back, and it's watching me. And with each passing night, it seems to get a little braver, coming a little closer to the house. Yesterday, I found one of my feed bin lids completely removed and set aside, not knocked off, not slid aside, but carefully taken off and placed nearby. Whatever did that has dexterity, purpose. I've thought about setting up more cameras, but after the last failures, I'm not sure technology is going to help me here. I've thought about moving, but this place is my home, and the animals I care for need stability. So I'm stuck in this bizarre situation, sharing my property with something I can't identify, can't predict, and can't seem to document. All I know is that when I walk near the woods now, that feeling of being watched is back, stronger than ever. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of something dark moving between the trees, always just out of focus, always gone when I turn to look directly at it. Story 14. I've never really talked about this before, not publicly. Anyway, my dad took the whole thing to his grave, and I've only shared it with a handful of close friends who probably think I'm either lying or crazy. But what happened that day in '79 has stuck with me for over 40 years now, and I still can't explain it. I was 10 years old then, living with my parents in Morrow, New York. It's this tiny place upstate that most people have never heard of. My dad was an avid fisherman, knew every stream, pond, and fishing hole within 50 miles. He could tell you where to catch the biggest bass or the tastiest trout, depending on the season, the weather, even the time of day. The man knew the outdoors like the back of his hand. It happened on a Saturday in early October. The leaves were changing, and Dad had decided we should head out to one of his favorite fishing spots near the Hudson. I wasn't particularly thrilled about it. I was more interested in the new X-Men comic I'd just gotten, but Dad insisted it would be good for me to get some fresh air. The drive to the river took us down Noland Road, which is this winding stretch that hugs the side of a mountain. If you've never been there, it's pretty nerve-wracking. On the right side, there's this crazy steep slope, I'd guess about 70 degrees, densely covered with trees and brush that climb straight up. On the left, it drops off like a cliff into more trees. Basically, you're driving on this narrow strip carved into the side of a mountain. I was in the back seat, completely absorbed in my comic book. It was issue 123, where Phoenix comes back, and I was totally engrossed. Dad was humming along to something on the radio, probably Johnny Cash or Willie Nelson, when suddenly the car jerked forward violently. I slammed into the back of the front seat, my comic flying out of my hands. "Jesus Christ!" Dad shouted. I'd never heard him yell like that. The car had stopped in the middle of the road. Dad was white-knuckling the steering wheel, his knuckles literally white, and staring out the windshield with his mouth hanging open. His face had gone completely pale. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked, feeling suddenly scared. My dad wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He was the guy who'd calmly shoo away bears from our campsite or handle snapping turtles with his bare hands. He didn't answer me at first. He just kept staring ahead, then turned to look out the driver's side window toward the drop-off. His breathing was heavy, almost like he'd been running. "Did you see that, Sammy?" he finally asked, his voice shaking. I hadn't seen anything. "See what?" He put the car in park but left it running. "Stay here," he ordered, opening his door and stepping out. I unbuckled my seatbelt and scrambled to the window. Dad was standing in the middle of the road, looking down over the embankment on the left side. Then he walked quickly across to the right side, staring up the steep slope. He kept running his hand through his hair, something he only did when he was really stressed. When he got back in the car, he just sat there for a minute, hands back on the wheel, staring straight ahead. "Dad?" I prompted again. "I don't know what that was," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Then he looked at me directly. "Something came down that hill, Sammy. Something big." He pointed to the steep slope on our right. It came bounding down that hillside, on two legs, not running on all fours like a bear, on two legs like a person, but it wasn't a person. It was covered in dark hair, dark brown or black, and it moved so fast, faster than any human could move down a slope that steep. My skin prickled. What was it? I don't know, he said again, shaking his head. It crossed the road right in front of us. That's why I had to slam on the brakes. Then it just jumped off the edge. He gestured to the left drop-off, just leaped right over, feet first, like it was diving into a swimming pool. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see something, anything, down in the trees below. But there was nothing. Could it have been a bear? I asked. We had black bears in the area, and I'd seen them stand on their hind legs before. Dad shook his head firmly. No. Bears don't run down slopes like that on two legs, and they don't jump off cliffs. Whatever this was, it moved like it knew exactly what it was doing, like the slope and the cliff were nothing to it. He put the car back in drive, but we just idled there for another minute before he finally started driving again, much slower than before. His eyes kept darting to the woods on either side of the road. How big was it? I asked, now fully alert and scanning the trees myself. Tall, he said, taller than me, maybe 6.5, 7 feet, and bulky, not fat, but solid, powerful looking. For context, my dad was 6 feet even and built sturdy from years of manual labor. The idea of something bigger than him that could move that fast down a steep slope made my stomach tight. Why didn't I see it? I asked, feeling both relieved and disappointed. It happened in seconds, Sammy. Just a few seconds. You were reading your comic. By the time you looked up, it was already gone. We drove the rest of the way to the fishing spot in silence. Dad kept scanning the tree line the whole time. When we got there, he decided we shouldn't stay, said he wasn't feeling it today. That was the first time in my life I'd ever seen my dad cancel a fishing trip after we'd already made the drive. On the way back, we took a different route, a longer one. Dad didn't say it, but I knew he was avoiding Noland Road. That night, I heard him telling my mom about it in hushed tones in the kitchen. I was supposed to be asleep, but I was sitting at the top of the stairs, straining to hear. I know what I saw, Linda, he insisted when my mum suggested it might have been a deer or even someone hiking. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know every animal that lives in them. This wasn't like anything I've ever seen. You think it was what? A Bigfoot? My mom sounded skeptical, almost amused, but trying not to show it. I didn't say that, Dad replied defensively. I don't know what it was. I'm just telling you what I saw. Well, what are you going to do about it? Mom asked. There was a pause. Nothing, Dad finally said. Who would I tell? The police. They'd think I was crazy or drunk. The paper. I don't need to be the local laughingstock. And that was that. We didn't talk about it again, at least not right away. But I noticed Dad started carrying his hunting rifle in the truck more often, even when he wasn't planning to hunt, and he stopped taking Noland Road entirely. About 3 months later, in January of '80, Dad came home with a copy of the Post-Star newspaper from Glens Falls. He was agitated, excited even. He called me into the kitchen and pointed at an article. Read this, he said. The article was about a group of young girls who had reported seeing a large, hairy creature while sledding in Washington County, which wasn't too far from us. According to the article, the investigating officer had gone to the location and claimed to have seen the creature himself, describing it as dark-colored, bipedal, and moving with unnatural speed through the snow. Dad tapped the paper. See? I'm not crazy, Sammy. Other people are seeing it too. I remember feeling a chill run through me. Until then, I'd half convinced myself that Dad had just seen a bear, or maybe a hiker in a dark coat. But now, with other sightings being reported and taken seriously enough to make the newspaper, it suddenly felt more real. That night, Dad told me more details about what he'd seen on Noland Road, things he hadn't mentioned before. How the creature's arms had swung differently than a human's would when running, how its head had seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with almost no visible neck. How, despite its size and the speed it was moving, it had made almost no sound coming down that slope, no crashing through underbrush, no heavy footfalls on the pavement as it crossed. It moved like it weighed nothing, he said, like gravity didn't quite apply to it the same way. Over the years, Dad became less hesitant to talk about what he'd seen, at least with me. He never became one of those Bigfoot enthusiasts with all the books and the TV shows and the expeditions. He didn't join any groups or try to go looking for the thing, but he also stopped dismissing the possibility outright. When shows about unexplained phenomena would come on TV, he'd watch them sometimes, nodding occasionally instead of scoffing like he used to. "I don't know what's out there," he'd say, "but I know what I saw, and I know there are things in this world we don't understand yet." Dad passed away in 2003 from a heart attack. He was out fishing, ironically, died doing what he loved. In the weeks after his funeral, I found myself driving out to Noland Road. I hadn't been on it since that day in '79. It looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating. The slope didn't seem quite as steep, the drop-off not quite as sheer. But as I drove slowly along, windows down, listening to the sounds of the forest, I could still feel a tingle of that old fear. What did my dad see that day? I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times. He wasn't a fanciful man. He didn't make things up or exaggerate. He was practical, level-headed, and knew the wilderness better than anyone I've ever met. If he said he saw something unexplainable on that road, then he saw something unexplainable. I've never seen anything like what he described. Sometimes I wish I had, that I'd looked up from my comic book just a few seconds earlier and caught a glimpse of whatever it was that changed how my dad saw the world. But maybe it's better that I didn't. Some things, once seen, can't be unseen. They change you. All I know is that something came bounding down that slope in '79, something that didn't move, like anything known to inhabit those woods. Something that could navigate a 70-degree slope with ease and leap off a cliff without hesitation. And to this day, whenever I'm driving on a lonely road through dense forest, I can't help but scan the trees, wondering what might be watching from just beyond my line of sight. Story 15. I've been debating whether to post this for years. Even writing it now, my hands are shaking and I keep looking out the window. I guess I need to get this off my chest, even if half of you think I'm crazy or making this up. I swear on everything I care about. This happened exactly as I'm about to describe it. This was back in 2002. I was 25, working as an IT consultant in Fort Collins, Colorado. After living with my parents to save money, I finally had enough for my own place. I found this small house about 20 miles outside town, surrounded by forest, but with a decent internet connection so I could work remotely most days. The rent was surprisingly affordable. Now I understand why. The first month was peaceful. I loved the solitude and the views. My red Ford F-150 pickup, my baby that I'd saved 3 years for, sat proudly in the gravel driveway. I'd wake up early, have coffee on the porch and listen to the forest. Sometimes I'd spot deer or even a fox. It felt perfect, until that Tuesday morning in October. I woke up around 6:30 to make coffee before a client call. Looking out my kitchen window, I froze. My truck, my 1,500-pound F-150, was completely flipped onto its side. Not just pushed over, but perfectly flipped, as if someone had lifted it and placed it down gently. I ran outside in my boxers and t-shirt, not even bothering with shoes. The ground was cold and damp with morning dew. I circled my truck, trying to process what I was seeing. The weirdest part? No broken glass, no dents, nothing to suggest it had been violently pushed over. It was just placed on its side. How did I not hear this happen? I'm not a deep sleeper. A truck flipping over should have woken me and probably half the forest, but there had been nothing. complete silence all night. I called a towing company, and they sent a guy named Mike about an hour later. He whistled when he saw my truck. "Man, that's weird," he said, walking around it. "Seen a couple like this recently. Was there a storm last night?" "No," I said. "Dead calm." He scratched his head. "Well, something strong did this. Maybe a Bigfoot," he laughed. I forced a smile, but something about his joke made my skin crawl. It took nearly 2 hours to get my truck upright and checked out. Surprisingly, there was minimal damage, just some scratches on the side that had been on the ground. Mike kept looking at the surrounding trees while we worked, and I caught him scanning the forest line several times. Before leaving, he hesitated. "Listen, be careful out here, all right? We've had a few weird calls from this area lately. Probably nothing, but just keep your doors locked." I brushed it off at the time. People in small towns always have their superstitions and ghost stories. A week passed uneventfully. I started parking my truck closer to the house, right under my bedroom window. Then, on Thursday morning, I stepped outside and immediately gagged from a horrific smell. About 15 feet from my porch was an enormous pile of... I don't even know how to describe it delicately. It was scat, animal droppings, but bigger than anything I'd ever seen. I'm talking the size of a large dinner plate, heaped up about 8 inches high. The stench was unbearable. Rotting meat, decay, musk. I grabbed a shovel from my shed, gagging as I approached it. When I reluctantly poked at it, I noticed something that turned my stomach. There were small bone fragments mixed in. Not twigs or plant matter like you'd find in bear scat. These were clearly bones, small ones, like from rabbits or squirrels. Black bears are common in Colorado, but this was way too large for bear scat. And bears don't typically defecate that close to human dwellings. It felt deliberate, like a message. I scooped it into a trash bag, dry heaving the entire time, and carried it deep into the woods to dispose of it away from my house. The whole time I felt watched. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just complete silence and the feeling of eyes on my back. I practically ran back to the house, locked the door, and spent the afternoon researching local wildlife. Nothing matched what I'd found. I called a friend who worked as a park ranger, describing what I'd seen without mentioning my growing fears. He suggested it might be several bears using the same spot, but didn't sound convinced. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every crack and rustle from outside made me jump. Around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted off, only to be jerked awake at 3:15 by a distinct sound. Footsteps on the gravel outside. Not 4-legged animal footsteps, these were bipedal. 2 feet, walking slowly around my house. I lay frozen in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening as whatever it was circled my house. The footsteps were heavy, making the gravel crunch loudly. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. Then came the scratching. At first, it was gentle, testing the window glass, then harder, more determined. Something was trying to get in. I reached for my phone with trembling hands, but the battery was dead. Of course it was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it. The scratching continued, becoming more aggressive. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep beside my bed and slowly, silently got up. My legs felt like jelly as I crept toward the window, staying to the side to avoid being seen. The moonlight cast just enough glow for me to make out a massive silhouette through the curtains. Whatever was out there was tall, much taller than me, and I'm 6'1". I could see what looked like long arms moving against the glass. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. With shaking hands, I pulled the curtain back just an inch. What I saw will haunt me forever. Pressed against my window was what I can only describe as a tall, dark-haired orangutan-like creature, but not an orangutan. Its face was more human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected reddish in the moonlight. It was using its massive hand to try to work the window latch, its fingers surprisingly dexterous. Our eyes met through the glass, and time seemed to stop. It knew I was watching it, and it didn't run away. Instead, it pressed its face closer to the window, lips pulling back to reveal yellow teeth. Then it made a sound I still hear in my nightmares, a low, rumbling snarl that started deep in its chest and built into something between a roar and a scream. The window actually vibrated from the force of it. Something in me snapped. Pure adrenaline took over. I yanked the curtains closed, grabbed my bat, and ran to the front door. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was operating on pure fight or flight, and somehow fight had won out. I burst through the front door, bat raised, screaming like a madman. I think I was hoping to scare it away. It worked for about 3 seconds. The creature had moved with incredible speed from my window to the side of the house. When I came out screaming, it initially retreated a few steps into the shadows, but then it straightened up to its full height, easily 7.5 feet tall, and turned toward me. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly now. Massive shoulders, powerful arms hanging nearly to its knees, dark, matted hair covering its entire body, and its face. God, its face. Not quite human, not quite ape, with a pronounced brow and a mouth too wide for any person. It took one step toward me, and the confidence that had propelled me outside evaporated instantly. This thing could tear me apart without breaking a sweat. I backpedaled toward my door, and it matched my movement with another step forward. We did this terrible dance for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. It was toying with me. When it took a third step, I turned and ran back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I rushed through the house, locking every window, pulling blinds, barricading the back door with my kitchen table. Then the footsteps started again, but not on the ground, on my roof. The entire ceiling creaked under tremendous weight as it walked across the top of my house. Dust and small bits of drywall sprinkled down with each step. It was heavy enough that I genuinely feared it might crash through. The footsteps stopped directly above my living room, where I stood clutching my bat like it could actually protect me. A deep, resonant knocking sound came next. 3 distinct knocks that seemed to vibrate through the entire structure. Then silence. I stood there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Dawn eventually came, and with it, the normal sounds of birds and forest life returned. Whatever had been there was gone, or at least no longer on my roof. When sunlight finally flooded through my windows, I threw some clothes and essentials into a duffel bag, ran to my truck, and drove straight to my parents' house. I broke my lease that same day. The landlord seemed unsurprised when I said I couldn't stay there anymore. I found a new place closer to town a few weeks later, no forests nearby, just neighbors and streetlights and the comforting sounds of traffic. I've spent years researching what I saw. I'm convinced it was what people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but I believe there are extremely unsettling details about these creatures that very few people know. They're not the gentle forest giants from the beef jerky commercials. They're intelligent, powerful predators with a mean streak. Sometimes I think about going public with my story, sharing the exact location, pushing for a proper investigation. But then I remember those eyes, that snarl, the casual display of strength in flipping my truck, and I wonder if revealing their existence might be too dangerous, not just for them, but for us. I still haven't been camping since. I don't hike anymore. And even now, in my well-lit suburban home, I sometimes wake up at 3:15 in the morning, hearing phantom footsteps on my roof and feeling those eyes watching me through the window. Story 16. I've never been one to believe in Bigfoot or any of that cryptid nonsense. My wife Mary and I always laughed at those TV shows where people run around the woods at night with thermal cameras, getting excited over every broken branch and weird noise. But what happened to us at Salt Fork State Park in Ohio has completely changed how I see things. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. It started back in March of 2011. We'd heard Salt Fork was beautiful in the spring, so we decided to do some hiking and primitive camping for a weekend getaway. The weather was perfect, not too cold, not too hot, just right for exploring the trails. The first weird thing happened while we were hiking away from our campsite. We'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes when we heard this howl in the distance. Now, I've heard plenty of animals in my life, dogs, wolves, owls, you name it. But this sound, it was like someone had mixed a dog's howl with an owl's screech, but deeper and more powerful. Mary grabbed my arm and whispered, "What the hell was that?" I just shrugged it off, saying it was probably some weird bird or maybe a coyote with a sore throat. We laughed nervously and kept walking. About 45 minutes. Later, we were on this horse trail that ran alongside a steep ravine. Mary spotted it first, this enormous barefoot print in the dirt. At first, I thought someone was playing a joke, but when I put my boot next to it, I wear a size 11, that print was easily 3 inches longer and 2 inches wider than my foot. And the thing was pressed almost an inch deep into soil that wasn't even particularly soft. Whatever made that print was heavy, really heavy. The strangest part was how the print seemed to have crossed the trail and then gone straight down this insanely steep slope. I'm talking about a 60-degree incline. No normal person would choose to go down that way. There was a proper trail just 50 yards ahead. Maybe it's a bear print, Mary suggested, but we both knew bear tracks don't look like giant human feet. I took some pictures on my flip phone, but they came out blurry and didn't really show the scale properly. Later that same day, we hiked over to this old cemetery in the park. We'd been there maybe 15 minutes when everything just stopped. The birds, the wind in the leaves, the distant sounds of other hikers. Everything went completely silent. It felt like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. The hair on my arm stood up, and I could tell Mary felt it too. She whispered that she was getting tired and wanted to head back. Since we'd hiked pretty far from our car, I told Mary to rest on a bench near the cemetery while I went back to get our vehicle. Big mistake. I'd walked maybe a quarter mile when I heard something moving through the leaves parallel to me, up on this 6 or 8 foot bank that ran alongside the trail. Whatever it was big enough to make a lot of noise moving through the dry leaves, but I couldn't see anything through the brush. The really creepy part, when I stopped walking, it stopped too. When I started again, so did it. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but there wasn't any breeze. That day, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I picked up my pace, almost jogging, and the movement alongside me sped up too. When I finally reached the car, I drove back to Mary as fast as I could. She was white as a ghost. While I was gone, she'd heard twigs snapping and heavy footsteps circling around behind the bench where she was sitting. She said it sounded like whatever it was kept coming closer, then backing away, like it was trying to work up the courage to approach her. We got out of there fast and didn't talk much about it afterward, just chalked it up to a weird day in the woods. We didn't go back to Salt Fork until 2013, after I retired. This time, we brought our pontoon boat with a camping enclosure. We thought staying on the water would be a nice change from tent camping. The first night, we anchored pretty close to shore in this secluded cove. Around 9:30, we were sitting inside the enclosure playing cards when we heard a huge splash right next to the boat. Something had thrown a large rock into the water barely 10 feet from us. I grabbed my flashlight and went out to look, but couldn't see anything on the shoreline, just dark woods. We convinced ourselves it was probably just a chunk of the bank that had fallen in, but deep down, I knew better. Rocks don't just throw themselves. Over the next few visits that summer, things got weirder. We'd beach the boat during the day to explore or have lunch on shore. Twice we found those same enormous footprints near where we docked. One set was particularly clear, pressed into this soft dirt where whatever it was had climbed uphill. You could even make out toe impressions, again, way bigger than my boot, with the same proportions as the print we'd seen 2 years earlier. One night that really sticks with me was when we were anchored about 30 feet from shore. Around 2 in the morning, we woke up to barred owl calls coming from the hills around us. If you've never heard a barred owl, they make this "who cooks for you" sound. But there were multiple calls from different directions, almost like they were communicating with each other. The weird part came when I unzipped the enclosure to listen better. The second that zipper made its noise, every single owl call stopped simultaneously. Complete silence. Owls don't coordinate like that. They don't all decide to shut up at the exact same moment. The most unsettling incident happened when our 4-year-old granddaughter Emma was with us. We'd beached the boat on this little sandy area, and Emma was playing at the water's edge while I helped her build a sandcastle. Mary was arranging our picnic lunch about 15 feet away. Suddenly, Mary gasped and froze, staring at something behind me up on the bank. When I turned around, I couldn't see anything unusual. But Mary was shaking. She grabbed Emma and hustled her back to the boat, insisting we leave immediately. It wasn't until we were back on the water that she told me what she'd seen. "There was something watching us from behind that big bush," she said, her voice trembling. It was huge, at least 3 feet wide at the shoulders. It had a face that looked almost human, but not human. The face didn't have hair, but its head and shoulders were covered in this shiny, dark brown hair, medium length. And the way it moved, she shuddered. It was swaying side to side, just watching us. It was about 40 feet away, but I could feel it staring right at us. I asked why I couldn't see it when I turned around, and she said it had stepped back behind the brush the moment I moved. I believed her. In 28 years of marriage, I'd never seen Mary so genuinely terrified. Our final trip to Salt Fork was in late September that same year. We'd anchored in our usual cove and were sitting on the deck of the pontoon after dark, looking at the stars. It was one of those perfect still nights where sound carries for miles. Around 10:30, we heard distinct footsteps coming down the hillside through the dry leaves, heading straight toward our boat. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight, one of those big ones that can light up a whole field, and switched it on, sweeping the beam across the entire slope. There was nothing there, nothing. But we'd both clearly heard something large walking through those leaves, and now there was nothing visible on that open hillside. Whatever had been approaching had either vanished into thin air or moved faster than anything I've ever seen when that light came on. That was the last time we took the boat to Salt Fork. We still go to the main lodge sometimes for dinner, but we don't venture into the remote parts of the park anymore. Mary refuses to even discuss what happened, says thinking about it gives her nightmares. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings in Ohio since then. Turns out Salt Fork State Park is one of the hotspots for sightings in the entire state. There are dozens of reports similar to our experiences. The rock throwing, the following behavior, the footprints. I don't know what to believe anymore. I was a practical man my whole life, worked in manufacturing, dealt with tangible things I could see and touch. But what followed me through those woods? What made those footprints? What was watching my family from the bank that day? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me awake some nights. All I know is that something is out there in those woods, something that doesn't want to be seen, but occasionally gets curious enough to reveal itself. And whatever it is, it's watching us far more often than we realize.